The thing about working the overnight shift on Alligator Alley is that you spend most of your time alone with nothing but the hum of your engine and the occasional set of headlights breaking through the darkness. Trooper Wesley Creighton had learned this truth during his 6 years with the Florida Highway Patrol, and he'd come to appreciate the solitude in ways he never expected when he first pinned on the badge. The stretch of Interstate 75 between Naples and Weston was a long, flat corridor cutting through the heart of the Everglades, bordered on both sides by swampland that seemed to swallow light and sound equally. During the day, the highway was busy with tourists and truckers making the cross-state haul, but after midnight it became something different entirely. The traffic thinned to almost nothing, and the world reduced itself to what Wesley's headlights could reach and what his instincts could process. It was late August 2019, and the heat hadn't broken even though the sun had set hours ago. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, making everything feel sticky and oppressive. Wesley had the air conditioning in his cruiser running full blast, but it barely made a dent in the thick Florida heat that seemed to seep through every seal and gap. He'd clocked in at the district barracks in Fort Myers at 2100 hours, gone through his standard vehicle inspection, checked his issued equipment twice, and pulled out onto the highway just after 2130. The radio had been quiet for most of the evening, just a few routine traffic stops and one disabled semi near mile marker 93 that another trooper had already handled. Sergeant Vance had checked in once around midnight to confirm Wesley's location, and Wesley had responded with his usual professional brevity. He liked Vance well enough. The man was fair and didn't micromanage, which was more than Wesley could say for some of the supervisors he'd worked under over the years. Around 0130 hours, Wesley was parked in his usual spot near mile marker 78, tucked into a maintenance road turnout that gave him a clear view of both eastbound and westbound lanes. It was a good location for catching speeders coming off the long straightaway, and it provided enough cover that most drivers didn't spot him until they were already past. He'd just finished the last of his coffee, lukewarm and bitter from sitting in the thermos too long, when he saw the vehicle. A dark sedan, looked like a Honda Accord, or maybe a Toyota Camry, traveling westbound at what appeared to be a reasonable speed. Nothing immediately suspicious about it, but something caught Wesley's attention anyway. Maybe it was the way the car seemed to drift slightly within its lane, or maybe it was just instinct built up over thousands of traffic stops, but Wesley found himself watching the vehicle more closely than usual. The sedan passed his position, and Wesley noted the license plate was partially obscured by dirt or mud, making it difficult to read the numbers clearly. That alone wasn't necessarily suspicious. Plenty of vehicles traveling through Florida picked up road grime, especially during the rainy season. But combined with the slight weaving pattern, it was enough to warrant a closer look. Wesley pulled out of the turnout and accelerated smoothly, keeping a safe distance behind the sedan as he followed it westbound. He watched the vehicle for nearly 2 miles, noting that the drift was consistent but not severe enough to suggest intoxication. The driver would drift toward the center line, then correct sharply, then settle back into a loose trajectory before the pattern repeated. No brake lights, no turn signals, just that same wandering path down the empty highway. It was the kind of driving that suggested distraction or extreme fatigue, and either one was dangerous enough on a road like this, where hitting the shoulder at highway speed could send a vehicle into the swamp before the driver even had time to react. Wesley reached for his radio and keyed the mic, his voice cutting through the static. "Dispatch, this is Unit 75. I've got a possible 1055 westbound on I-75 near mile marker 76. Vehicle is showing signs of impaired or distracted driving. Running a plate now, but it's partially obscured. Stand by." He rattled off what numbers he could make out from the license plate, squinting through the glare of his headlights bouncing off the sedan's rear window. The dispatcher's voice crackled back after a moment, professional and efficient. Unit 75, copy that. Stand by for registration. Wesley kept his eyes on the sedan while he waited, his right hand resting near the gear shift, ready to accelerate if the vehicle suddenly took off or made any unexpected moves. The Everglades at night had a way of making people nervous, and nervous drivers sometimes made bad decisions when they saw police lights in their rearview mirror. The dispatcher came back after what felt like a long wait but was probably only 30 seconds. Unit 75. Registration comes back to a 2017 Honda Accord, gray in color. Registered owner is listed as Patricia Ann Holcomb, female, white, age 54, address in Tallahassee. Registration is current, no wants or warrants on file. Vehicle is not reported stolen. Wesley acknowledged the information and made his decision. He flipped on his overhead lights, the red and blue strobes cutting through the darkness and reflecting off the wet pavement. The sedan didn't respond immediately, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes drivers were so lost in their own thoughts or their phone screens that they didn't notice police lights right away. Wesley gave it a few more seconds, then added a quick burst of his siren, just enough to get attention without being aggressive. The sedan's brake lights finally came on, and the vehicle began to slow, drifting toward the shoulder in that same loose, uncertain way it had been drifting in its lane. Wesley stayed back, giving the vehicle plenty of room to come to a complete stop. When it finally did, it was positioned half on the paved shoulder and half on the grass, the right rear tire just inches from the edge where the ground dropped off into the swamp. Wesley pulled in behind the sedan, leaving about 20 feet between vehicles, and reached for the radio again. Dispatch, 1027 at mile marker 75, westbound shoulder. Single occupant visible, appears to be a female driver matching the registered owner's description. Vehicle is a gray Honda Accord, plate number partially obscured but matches registration on file. Dispatch acknowledged, and Wesley took a moment to observe the vehicle and the surrounding area before stepping out of his cruiser. The night was thick with the sounds of the Everglades, frogs croaking in the distance, the occasional splash of something moving through water, and the ever-present buzz of insects drawn to the lights of the two vehicles. The air smelled like wet vegetation and decay, the characteristic scent of the swamp that never really went away no matter how long you'd been working this stretch of highway. Wesley grabbed his flashlight, adjusted his duty belt out of habit, and stepped out into the humid night. His boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as he approached the driver's side of the sedan, his eyes scanning constantly, taking in every detail. The car was older, but well-maintained, no visible damage or signs of neglect. The rear window had a thin layer of road dust, and the license plate was indeed partially obscured by dried mud that looked like it had been there for a while. Wesley positioned himself slightly behind the driver's door, a tactical stance he'd learned early in his career that gave him a clear view of the interior, while keeping him out of the direct line of fire if things went wrong. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, 2 firm knocks that were loud enough to be heard but not aggressive. The window rolled down slowly, and Wesley found himself looking at a woman who appeared to be in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back into a loose bun and eyes that looked exhausted and red-rimmed. She wasn't crying, but she had the appearance of someone who had been crying recently or hadn't slept in days. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension, and she stared straight ahead for a moment before slowly turning her head to look at him. Her expression was difficult to read, not defiant or scared, just blank and distant, as if she was looking at him from very far away. Wesley kept his tone professional but not unkind. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Trooper Creighton with the Florida Highway Patrol. The reason I stopped you tonight is because I observed your vehicle drifting between lanes for approximately 2 miles. I need to see your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance, please." The woman blinked slowly, processing his words as if they were coming to her through water, or from a great distance. She didn't respond immediately, and Wesley could see her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. After what felt like a long pause, she reached over to the passenger seat with movements that were slow and mechanical, almost robotic. Wesley's training kicked in automatically, and he shifted his weight slightly, his right hand moving closer to his service weapon without actually touching it. He kept his flashlight trained on her hands, watching carefully as she fumbled through a purse that was sitting on the passenger seat. She pulled out a wallet and handed him a Florida driver's license without meeting his eyes. Wesley took it and examined it under the beam of his flashlight. The name read Patricia Ann Holcomb, and the photo matched the woman in front of him, though the picture looked like it had been taken in better times. The woman in the photo was smiling slightly, her hair neatly styled, her face relaxed. The woman sitting in the car now looked like she'd aged 10 years since that photo was taken. Wesley noted the birth date, which confirmed she was 54, and the address in Tallahassee matched what dispatch had provided. He handed the license back and repeated his request. "I'll also need your registration and proof of insurance, ma'am." Patricia reached into the glove compartment this time, her movements still slow and deliberate, and pulled out a folded envelope. She handed it to Wesley without a word, her eyes drifting back to stare straight ahead through the windshield at nothing in particular. Wesley opened the envelope and checked the documents. Everything appeared to be in order. The vehicle was registered to her, and the insurance was current with a policy through a major carrier. He leaned down slightly, trying to get a better look at her face and gauge her condition. "Ma'am, have you had anything to drink tonight? Any alcohol or medications that might affect your ability to drive?" Patricia shook her head slowly, her voice coming out flat and distant when she finally spoke. "No, nothing like that." Wesley studied her for another moment, taking in the details. There was no odor of alcohol coming from the vehicle, no obvious signs of drug use, and her speech wasn't slurred. Her pupils looked normal, not dilated or constricted in ways that would suggest intoxication or drug use. But there was definitely something wrong. The exhaustion in her eyes went beyond simple fatigue, and there was a hollowness to her expression that suggested something deeper, something psychological rather than physical. Wesley straightened up slightly and tried a different approach. "Ma'am, where are you headed tonight? Are you traveling alone?" Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she was quiet for so long that Wesley thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just driving. Heading west." Wesley frowned slightly. "West? Toward where specifically? Do you have a destination in mind?" Another long pause, and then Patricia turned her head to look at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were empty, devoid of the emotion or engagement you'd expect from someone having a normal conversation. "I don't know. I'm just driving. I can't stop driving." That answer sent up red flags in Wesley's mind. He'd worked enough welfare checks and mental health calls to recognize when someone was in crisis, and Patricia Ann Holcomb was showing multiple signs of psychological distress. The vague answers, the flat affect, the compulsive statement about not being able to stop driving, all of it pointed to someone who was either running from something or running toward something, neither of which was likely to end well on a deserted stretch of highway in the middle of the night. Wesley made a decision and took a step back from the vehicle, giving himself a better vantage point and some tactical distance. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle for me, please. I want to make sure you're okay to continue driving, and I need to conduct a few basic tests." Patricia's head turned slowly back toward the windshield, and she sat there for a moment as if considering whether to comply. Wesley kept his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle now, please. This is for your safety and the safety of other drivers on the road." Finally, Patricia opened the door and stepped out onto the shoulder. She was shorter than Wesley had expected, maybe 5 feet 4 inches tall, and thin in a way that suggested she hadn't been eating regularly. She was wearing jeans and a faded blue t-shirt, both of which looked like they'd been worn for several days without being changed. Her hair was coming loose from the bun, strands hanging down around her face, and her sneakers were scuffed and dirty. She moved with a kind of mechanical stiffness that reminded Wesley of someone sleepwalking, going through the motions but not really present. Wesley gestured towards the rear of the vehicle, positioning himself so he could keep an eye on both Patricia and the traffic passing by on the highway. "I'm going to have you perform a few standard field sobriety tests, just to make sure you're safe to drive. I need you to walk heel to toe in a straight line for 9 steps, turn around, and walk back. Can you do that for me?" Patricia nodded slowly and attempted the test. She walked the line without losing her balance, her movements slow but steady. Wesley had her perform several more tests, standing on one foot, following his finger with her eyes, and each time she passed without difficulty. Physically, she was sober and capable, but the psychological state she was in was concerning enough that Wesley knew he couldn't just let her drive away. He lowered his flashlight and looked at Patricia with genuine concern. "Ma'am, you're not showing any signs of intoxication, but I'm worried about your mental state. You seem exhausted, and your answers are concerning me. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is there someone I can call for you, family or friends who might be able to help?" Patricia's expression didn't change, but Wesley saw something flicker in her eyes, just for a fraction of a second. It might have been fear or sadness or resignation, but it was gone before he could identify it clearly. She shook her head. "I'm fine. I just need to keep moving. I have to keep driving." Wesley kept his voice gentle. "Why do you have to keep driving? What are you running from?" Patricia's lips pressed together in a thin line, and the walls Wesley had sensed went up even higher. "I'm not running from anything. I just can't stop. Not yet." Wesley tried one more approach. "Ma'am, if you're in danger, or if someone is threatening you, I can help. There are resources available, shelters, victim advocates, people who specialize in helping people in difficult situations, but I need you to tell me what's going on." Patricia looked at him for a long moment, and Wesley could see her considering it, weighing whether to trust him with whatever burden she was carrying. But in the end, she just shook her head again. "You can't help me. Nobody can help me. I just need to keep driving until I find it." Wesley's concern deepened. "Until you find what?" But Patricia had shut down completely now. Her face had gone blank again, and she stood there in silence, staring at the ground. Wesley knew he'd pushed as far as he could without crossing lines he wasn't supposed to cross. He couldn't force her to accept help if she didn't want it, and he couldn't detain her without probable cause for a crime. She wasn't intoxicated, she wasn't wanted, and technically she hadn't violated any laws beyond the minor lane drift that had prompted the initial stop. Wesley pulled out his citation book and wrote up a written warning for improper lane usage, then handed it to Patricia. "Ma'am, I'm going to let you go with a warning, but I strongly recommend you find a rest stop or a hotel and get some sleep. You're exhausted, and that's dangerous. If you keep driving in this condition, you're putting yourself and others at risk." Patricia took the paper without looking at it and nodded once. "Thank you, officer." She walked back to her car, climbed in, and started the engine. Wesley watched as she pulled back onto the highway, her taillights disappearing into the darkness, heading west. He stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the encounter settling on him like the humid air. Something about this stop felt fundamentally wrong, as if he'd just let something important slip through his fingers. He'd felt this way before on other calls, that sense that there was more to the story than what was visible on the surface, but this time it was stronger. Patricia Ann Holcomb wasn't just tired or distracted. She was searching for something. driven by a compulsion she couldn't or wouldn't explain, and Wesley had the sinking feeling that whatever she was looking for, she wasn't going to find anything good when she got there. He returned to his cruiser and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the empty highway ahead. The radio crackled with occasional traffic from other units, but Wesley barely heard it. His mind was turning over the details of the stop, replaying Patricia's words and the empty look in her eyes. "I can't stop driving. I have to keep driving until I find it." Find what? And why couldn't she stop? Wesley reached for his radio, almost keyed the mic to call it in again and request a welfare check follow-up. But he stopped himself. What would he even say? That he had a bad feeling? That the woman seemed sad and tired? That wasn't enough to warrant additional resources or intervention. He'd done everything by the book, checked for impairment, offered assistance, and issued a warning. There was nothing more he could legally or ethically do unless Patricia herself asked for help or committed a crime. Wesley pulled back onto the highway and continued his patrol westbound, following the same route Patricia had taken. Part of him hoped he might catch up to her, find her pulled over at a rest stop, getting the sleep she desperately needed. But mile after mile passed, and there was no sign of the gray Honda Accord. By the time Wesley's shift ended at 0630, the sun was beginning to rise over the Everglades, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the still water of the swamp. He returned to the barracks, filed his report noting the traffic stop and the warning issued, and clocked out. But as he drove home to his small apartment in Fort Myers, the image of Patricia Ann Holcomb's hollow eyes stayed with him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered something far darker and more complicated than a routine traffic stop. Wesley Creighton didn't sleep well that day. He'd gone home to his apartment, a modest one-bedroom place on the outskirts of Fort Myers that he'd been renting for the past 3 years, showered off the night's accumulated sweat and road grime, and climbed into bed around 0800 hours. But sleep refused to come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Patricia Ann Holcomb's face, that hollow expression in the way she'd said she couldn't stop driving, as if it was a compulsion beyond her control, rather than a choice she was making. He kept replaying the moment when he'd asked what she was looking for, and the way she'd shut down completely, retreating behind walls that no amount of questioning could penetrate. By 1400 hours, Wesley gave up on sleep entirely and sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at his phone. He thought about calling Sergeant Vance and running the stop by him again, explaining his concerns and seeing if there was anything more they could do. But what would he say that wasn't already in his report? Woman stopped for lane drift, passed sobriety tests, given a warning, no violations beyond the minor traffic infraction. Everything had been by the book, and without evidence of a crime or an immediate threat to herself or others, there wasn't much anyone could do. Vance was a good supervisor, fair and experienced, but he was also a pragmatist who dealt in facts and evidence rather than gut feelings and hunches. Without something concrete, a call to Vance would just be wasting everyone's time. Wesley scrolled through his mental notes from the encounter, trying to find something he might have missed. Patricia Ann Holcomb, Tallahassee address, clean record, current registration and insurance, no warrants or flags in the system. A 54-year-old woman driving alone at night on a nearly empty highway, tired and distressed but not technically breaking any laws. It should have been routine, the kind of stop Wesley had made hundreds of times before. But something about it had gotten under his skin and wouldn't let go. By the time his next shift rolled around that evening, Wesley had convinced himself he was overthinking the situation. People drove through Florida all the time dealing with personal problems, running from bad relationships or dead-end jobs, searching for something they couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't his job to fix their lives or solve their problems, only to keep the roads safe and enforce the laws. He clocked in at 2100 hours, went through his vehicle inspection with the same careful attention to detail he always used, and pulled out onto Interstate 75 just after 2130. The weather had shifted slightly, the humidity still oppressive, but now accompanied by distant flashes of lightning on the horizon that suggested a storm system moving in from the Gulf. Dispatch was busier tonight than it had been the previous evening. Multiple calls for minor accidents and a disabled vehicle near the Lee County line that was blocking the right lane. Wesley handled 2 routine traffic stops in the first hour, both for speeding, and was settling into the rhythm of the shift when the radio crackled with a call that made his attention sharpen immediately. All units in the vicinity of Interstate 75 westbound. We have a report of an abandoned vehicle near mile marker 68, just past the Collier County rest area. Caller reports the vehicle has been stationary on the shoulder for at least 2 hours with no occupant visible, requesting welfare check and 1027. Wesley grabbed the mic before any other unit could respond, his pulse quickening with a sense of recognition he couldn't quite explain. Dispatch, Unit 75, responding. I'm approximately 8 miles east of that location. ETA 10 minutes. Dispatch acknowledged, and Wesley accelerated westbound, his mind already running through possibilities. Mile marker 68 was about 7 miles west of where he'd stopped Patricia Holcomb the previous night, and she'd been heading in that direction when he'd let her go. It could be a coincidence. There were plenty of abandoned vehicles on this stretch of highway for various reasons. Mechanical failure, accidents, people who simply ran out of gas. But Wesley's instincts were telling him this wasn't a coincidence, and over 6 years of working the roads, he'd learned to trust those instincts. He covered the distance in just under 9 minutes, his headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the reflective markers along the shoulder. As he approached mile marker 68, his spotlight swept across the right shoulder and caught the outline of a vehicle parked at an awkward angle. The front end pointed slightly toward the swamp as if the driver had pulled over in a hurry. Wesley slowed and pulled in behind the vehicle, his overhead lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Even before he came to a complete stop, he recognized the gray Honda Accord and felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of vindication and dread. He keyed the radio, keeping his voice professional despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his system. Dispatch, Unit 75 on scene at mile marker 68. Vehicle is a gray Honda Accord, matches the description from my traffic stop last night. Florida registration appears to be the same vehicle registered to Patricia Ann Holcomb. No occupant visible from my current position. I'm going to conduct a 1027 now. Dispatch acknowledged, and Wesley sat in his cruiser for a moment, scanning the area and taking in the details. The Honda was parked completely on the shoulder this time, all 4 tires on the gravel, and the vehicle was dark with no lights on inside or out. The driver's door appeared to be closed, and there was no movement visible through the windows. Wesley stepped out of his cruiser, his hand instinctively checking that his service weapon was secure in its holster, and approached the Honda cautiously. The night sounds of the Everglades surrounded him, the constant chorus of frogs and insects punctuated by the occasional splash of something large moving through the water just beyond the tree line. The air smelled like standing water and vegetation, thick and heavy in his lungs. Wesley moved up along the driver's side of the vehicle, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior. The car was empty, no occupant in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, and the back seat appeared clear as well. He tried the driver's door handle and found it unlocked, which immediately raised more flags in his mind. People didn't usually abandon their vehicles with the doors unlocked unless they'd left in a hurry or under some kind of duress. Wesley opened the door carefully, letting it swing wide, and leaned in to examine the interior more closely. The smell hit him immediately, not the metallic scent of blood or the chemical odor of drugs, but something stale and lived in, like someone had been spending extended periods of time in this vehicle. The driver's seat was pushed back as far as it would go, and there was a pillow and a blanket wadded up in the back seat along with several plastic grocery bags filled with what looked like clothes. The passenger seat had a road atlas open to a map of Florida, with several locations marked in red pen. Wesley studied the map for a moment, noting that the marks seemed to follow Interstate 75 from Tallahassee down through the state, with concentrations around certain areas in Collier County and further south toward the Miami area. There were also notes written in the margins of the map, dates and times that meant nothing to Wesley without more context, but which suggested Patricia had been planning this trip or tracking something specific. The center console held the usual debris of someone living out of their car, fast food receipts, empty water bottles, a half-eaten bag of chips, and several crumpled pieces of paper that looked like printouts from a computer. Wesley carefully extracted one of the papers and unfolded it, shining his flashlight on the text. It was a printout from a missing persons database, dated 3 weeks prior, showing a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. The information listed her name as Rebecca Lynn Pritchard, age 22, last seen in Tallahassee 6 months ago. The physical description noted she was 5 feet 6 inches tall, approximately 120 pounds, with brown hair and hazel eyes. There was a contact number listed for anyone with information, and at the bottom of the page, someone had written in pen, Alligator Alley, mile marker range 50-80, check rest areas and turnouts. Wesley felt a chill run down his spine despite the oppressive heat. He pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the printout, then carefully searched the rest of the vehicle's interior. In the glove compartment, he found more printouts, at least a dozen of them, all from the same missing persons database, and all showing different young women who had disappeared from various locations across northern Florida over the past 2 years. Some of the printouts had notes written on them, dates and locations, possible sightings or leads that had apparently gone nowhere. In the back seat, under the blanket, Wesley found a spiral notebook filled with handwritten entries that appeared to be a journal or log of some kind. He flipped through the pages quickly, seeing dates and locations, observations about traffic patterns and rest area activity, and what looked like license plate numbers with notes beside them. Wesley stepped back from the vehicle and keyed his radio again, his mind racing to process what he'd just found. Dispatch, Unit 75. I need Sergeant Vance on the line, priority. There was a brief pause. Then Vance's voice came through, gruff and alert despite the late hour. Unit 75, this is Vance. Go ahead. Wesley chose his words carefully, aware that everything he said was being recorded. Sarge, I'm at the abandoned vehicle from last night's traffic stop. Driver is still not present, but I found multiple printouts of missing persons reports in the vehicle, along with detailed notes and what appears to be an investigation log. The vehicle matches all the details from Patricia Ann Holcomb, the woman I stopped last night for lane drift. I think we need to treat this as more than just an abandoned vehicle. There was a longer pause this time, and Wesley could almost hear Vance thinking through the implications. When the sergeant's voice came back, it was measured and careful. What's the condition of the vehicle? Any signs of struggle or foul play? Wesley looked around the Honda again, examining it with fresh eyes. Negative on signs of struggle. Vehicle is unlocked, keys are not in the ignition, and there's no purse or wallet visible. But the amount of personal items suggests the driver has been living out of the car for some time. The missing persons printouts all appear to be young women who disappeared from northern Florida locations over the past 2 years, and there are detailed notes about this specific area of I-75. Vance was quiet for another moment, then made his decision. All right, here's what we're going to do. I want you to secure that vehicle and establish a perimeter. Do not enter the vehicle again or remove any items without proper documentation. I'm going to contact our criminal investigation unit and see about getting a detective out there to process this as a potential evidence scene. In the meantime, I want you to conduct a search of the immediate area, check the tree line, and any obvious places where someone might have gone on foot." Wesley acknowledged and set about securing the scene. He placed road flares behind his cruiser to alert any traffic, used crime scene tape to mark off the area around the Honda, and then grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight to begin searching the surrounding area. The shoulder of the highway was wide here, maybe 15 feet of gravel and grass before the ground dropped off into the swamp proper. Wesley walked slowly along the shoulder in both directions from the Honda, sweeping his flashlight across the ground and looking for any signs of foot traffic or disturbance. The grass was thick and weedy, growing up through the gravel in patches, and it was difficult to tell if anyone had walked through recently. About 20 yards west of the Honda, Wesley found something that made him stop. There were depressions in the grass that could have been footprints, small ones that suggested a woman's shoe, leading away from the shoulder and down the embankment toward the water. Wesley carefully made his way down the slope, using his flashlight to illuminate the path. The ground was soft and muddy, and the footprints became clearer as he descended. They led to the edge of the water, then disappeared. Wesley stood at the water's edge, shining his flashlight across the dark surface of the swamp, but saw nothing except the reflection of his light on the still water and the occasional ripple from something moving beneath the surface. He called out, his voice carrying across the water and echoing slightly off the vegetation. "Patricia, this is Trooper Creighton with the Florida Highway Patrol. If you can hear me, please respond." The only answer was the continued chorus of frogs and insects, indifferent to his presence. Wesley climbed back up to the shoulder and continued his search, checking the tree line on both sides of the highway for any sign of where Patricia might have gone. He found nothing else, no more footprints, no clothing or personal items, just the empty highway and the dark swamp pressing in from both sides. By the time Sergeant Vance arrived 40 minutes later, followed by a criminal investigations detective named Marvin Kellard, Wesley had thoroughly searched a 200-yard radius around the Honda and found nothing beyond the single set of footprints leading to the water. Kellard was a lean man in his early 50s with sharp eyes and a methodical manner that Wesley recognized immediately as someone who'd worked a lot of complex cases. He listened without interrupting as Wesley walked him through everything, from the initial traffic stop the night before to finding the abandoned vehicle and the missing persons printouts inside. Kellard examined the vehicle himself, taking photographs and making notes, then turned his attention to the printouts and the notebook Wesley had found. He studied them in silence for several minutes, his expression growing darker as he read through the handwritten entries. Finally, Kellard looked up at Wesley. "You said the woman you stopped last night, Patricia Ann Holcomb. She told you she couldn't stop driving and that she was looking for something." Wesley nodded. "That's correct. She was vague about it. Wouldn't give me specifics, but she seemed driven by something. Obsessed, maybe. I got the impression she was searching for something or someone, but she wouldn't tell me what." Kellard held up one of the printouts, the one showing Rebecca Lynn Pritchard. "Did she mention this name or any of the other names on these missing persons reports?" Wesley shook his head. "No, sir. She didn't mention any names. She just kept saying she had to keep driving until she found it." Kellard was quiet for a moment, thinking. Rebecca Lynn Pritchard disappeared 6 months ago from Tallahassee. She was a college student at Florida State University, last seen leaving a bar with friends around midnight. Her car was found 3 days later, abandoned, on Interstate 75 near mile marker 72, about 4 miles from where we're standing right now. The case has been open ever since. No leads, no witnesses, no body. Just a missing 22-year-old woman who vanished into thin air. Wesley felt something click into place in his mind. Pritchard. That's the same last name as Patricia. Are they related? Kellard nodded slowly. According to the missing persons report, Rebecca Lynn Pritchard's mother is listed as the primary contact. Her name is Patricia Ann Holcomb Pritchard. Looks like she goes by her married name for some things and her maiden name for others, but it's the same person. Patricia is Rebecca's mother. The weight of that revelation settled on Wesley like a physical thing. Patricia Ann Holcomb wasn't just some distressed woman driving aimlessly through the night. She was a mother searching for her missing daughter, following a trail of missing persons cases that all seemed to intersect in this particular stretch of the Everglades. The printouts, the detailed notes, the obsessive documentation of license plates and locations. It all made sense now in a way that was both heartbreaking and deeply troubling. Wesley looked at Kellard. So she's been out here conducting her own investigation. Kellard's expression was grim. Looks that way. And based on these notes, she's been doing it for months. She's tracked down at least a dozen cases of young women who disappeared along this corridor, all of them within a similar age range and physical description to her daughter. She's documented patterns, identified what she thinks are suspicious vehicles, and she's been living out of her car while she does it. Sergeant Vance, who'd been listening to the exchange, spoke up. The question is, where is she now? And did she find something that put her in danger? Kellard looked toward the water where Wesley had found the footprints. We need to organize a search. If she went into the swamp, either voluntarily or because someone forced her, we need to find her quickly. This environment is unforgiving, and if she's injured or lost out there, she won't survive long. Vance nodded and reached for his radio to coordinate additional resources. Wesley stood by the Honda, looking at the collection of missing persons printouts spread across the hood where Kellard had laid them out. 12 young women, all between the ages of 19 and 25, all disappeared from northern Florida locations over the past 2 years, and all of their vehicles had been found abandoned along Interstate 75 in Collier County. The pattern was impossible to ignore, and Patricia had clearly seen it too. She'd been trying to find her daughter, but somewhere along the way she'd uncovered something much larger and more sinister. Kellard walked over to stand beside Wesley, following his gaze to the printouts. You did good work stopping her last night and documenting your observations. Without your report, we wouldn't have connected her to this vehicle or understood what she was doing out here. Wesley didn't feel like he'd done good work. He felt like he'd let a grieving mother slip through his fingers, failed to see the depth of her desperation, and now she was missing too, possibly another victim of whatever predator had been hunting along this stretch of highway. He looked at Kellard. What's the plan now? Kellard began gathering up the printouts and placing them in evidence bags. First, we process this vehicle completely and document everything. Then we organize a grid search of the area, starting with the water where you found the footprints and expanding outward. We'll need to contact Patricia's family, see if anyone knows what she was doing, or if she communicated her plans to anyone. And we need to pull every piece of data we can on these missing persons cases, see if there are any connections beyond the obvious geographic pattern. Wesley watched as a tow truck arrived to impound the Honda, and as additional patrol units and search and rescue personnel began assembling for the search operation. The night was wearing on, the distant storm clouds moving closer and bringing with them the threat of rain that would make searching the swamp even more difficult. Wesley joined the search teams, wading through knee-deep water and pushing through thick vegetation, calling Patricia's name into the darkness and getting nothing back but the indifferent sounds of the Everglades. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed ominous rather than beautiful, they'd found nothing. No body, no clothing, no additional footprints beyond the single trail leading to the water. Patricia Ann Holcomb had vanished as completely as her daughter had 6 months before. swallowed by the same stretch of highway that had claimed so many others. Wesley stood on the shoulder as the search was suspended to regroup and plan the next phase, and he stared out at the swamp with a growing sense of dread that this case was far from over, and that whatever Patricia had found in her desperate search for answers, it had found her first. The search for Patricia Ann Holcomb continued throughout the following day, expanding from the immediate area around mile marker 68 to a wider grid that covered several square miles of swampland on both sides of Interstate 75. Wesley Creighton worked a double shift, refusing to go home even when Sergeant Vance offered to relieve him. He felt a personal responsibility for Patricia's disappearance, a nagging sense that if he'd pushed harder during that initial traffic stop, if he'd recognized the depth of her obsession and desperation, maybe she wouldn't have vanished into the Everglades. Police Marvin Kellard coordinated the search effort from a command post set up near the Collier County Rest Area, bringing in resources from multiple agencies including the Collier County Sheriff's Office, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and a specialized swamp search team that had experience navigating the unique challenges of the Everglades environment. By midday, they deployed airboats to search the deeper water channels and had tracking dogs working the areas where the vegetation was dense enough to hide a person, but not so thick that the dogs couldn't move through it. The heat was brutal, the kind of oppressive Florida summer heat that made every breath feel like inhaling steam, and the humidity hung in the air so thick you could almost see it. Wesley worked alongside a fish and wildlife officer named Dutch Carmody, a weathered man in his 60s who'd spent his entire career in the Everglades and knew the terrain better than anyone. They pushed through sawgrass that cut at exposed skin, waded through water that was sometimes ankle deep and sometimes chest deep, and constantly watched for alligators and snakes that were far more at home in this environment than any human could ever be. Dutch pointed out signs that Wesley would have missed, disturbances in the vegetation that might indicate someone had passed through, broken branches that were too fresh to be from natural causes, and areas where the water was disturbed in patterns that suggested recent activity rather than just the normal movement of wildlife. But despite all the expertise and effort, they found nothing conclusive. There were no more footprints beyond the ones Wesley had discovered leading to the water's edge. No articles of clothing snagged on branches. No signs of struggle or violence. It was as if Patricia had simply walked into the swamp and been absorbed by it, leaving no trace behind. By late afternoon, Kellard made the difficult decision to scale back the active search and shift to a recovery mode, which everyone understood meant they were no longer looking for a living person, but rather for a body. Wesley couldn't accept that, not yet, but he understood the practical realities. They'd searched every accessible area within a reasonable radius. The dogs had found no scent trail to follow, and the airboats had covered miles of waterways without finding anything. If Patricia was out there, she was either beyond their reach or she didn't want to be found. Wesley finally agreed to go home and get some rest when Vance made it a direct order rather than a suggestion. He drove back to Fort Myers as the sun was setting, his uniform soaked with swamp water and sweat, his body exhausted but his mind still racing. He showered and tried to eat something, but the food tasted like cardboard and sat heavy in his stomach. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and began researching the missing persons cases that Patricia had documented in her notebook. The first case was Rebecca Lynn Pritchard, Patricia's daughter, who had disappeared 6 months earlier. Wesley pulled up every news article and police report he could find about Rebecca's disappearance. She'd been a junior at Florida State University, studying marine biology with plans to work in conservation. By all accounts, she was a good student, well liked by her peers with no history of drug use or risky behavior. On the night she disappeared, Rebecca had gone out with 3 friends to a popular bar near campus, had stayed until around midnight, then told her friends she was tired and was going to head home. She'd walked to her car alone, which was parked about 2 blocks from the bar, and that was the last time anyone saw her. Her car, a silver Honda Civic, was found 3 days later on Interstate 75 near mile marker 72, parked on the shoulder with the keys still in the ignition and her purse on the passenger seat. There was no sign of Rebecca, no indication of where she'd gone or what had happened to her. The investigation had focused initially on the possibility that she'd been abducted, but there were no witnesses, no surveillance footage that showed anything useful, and no physical evidence at the scene beyond some tire tracks that could have belonged to any of thousands of vehicles. The case had gone cold within weeks, and Rebecca's disappearance had become just another unsolved missing persons case in a state that saw hundreds of them every year. Wesley read through Patricia's own statements to police, given in those first desperate weeks after her daughter vanished. She'd told investigators that Rebecca had no reason to run away, no problems that would have driven her to disappear voluntarily, and no romantic relationship that might have gone wrong. Patricia had begged them to keep searching, to expand the investigation, to consider the possibility that Rebecca's disappearance was connected to other cases, but without evidence there was only so much the police could do. Wesley moved on to the other missing persons printouts Patricia had collected, and as he read through case after case, a disturbing pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Melissa Ray Thornton, age 23, disappeared from Gainesville 14 months ago. Her car was found on Interstate 75 near mile marker 58. Amanda Louise Kirby, age 19, disappeared from Ocala 18 months ago. Her car was found on Interstate 75 near mile marker 63. Sarah Jane Colfax, age 21, disappeared from Jacksonville 20 months ago. Her car was found on Interstate 75 near mile marker 77. The list went on, 12 cases in total, all young women between the ages of 19 and 25. All disappeared from cities in northern Florida, and all of their vehicles found abandoned on the same stretch of Interstate 75 between mile markers 50 and 80. The geographic concentration was striking, and the fact that all the victims fit a similar demographic profile suggested this wasn't random. Patricia had seen the pattern, and she'd been right to be obsessed with it. Wesley pulled up a map and marked each location where a vehicle had been found, and the pattern became even clearer. The abandoned vehicles formed a cluster along a roughly 30-mile stretch of highway that cut through the most remote and unpopulated section of the Everglades. This was the section known locally as Alligator Alley, where there were no exits for miles, no gas stations or rest stops beyond the single facility at mile marker 70, and no civilization beyond the highway itself. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone who knew how to use the isolation and the environment to their advantage. Wesley felt a chill despite the warm air in his apartment. He'd been patrolling this stretch of highway for 6 years, had made countless traffic stops and welfare checks, and had never once considered that there might be a serial predator operating in the area. But now that he saw the evidence laid out, it seemed obvious and terrifying. He pulled up the case files for each of the missing women, using his law enforcement credentials to access the databases, and began looking for additional connections. Most of the cases had been investigated by different agencies depending on where the victim had last been seen, and there didn't appear to be any coordination between the investigations. Each case had been treated as an individual missing persons report, and while some had been flagged as possible abductions, none of them had been connected as part of a larger pattern. Wesley understood why jurisdictional issues, resource limitations, and the simple fact that missing persons cases were tragically common in Florida. But Patricia had connected them because she'd been looking at the evidence through the lens of a mother's desperation, and she'd seen what the professional investigators had missed. Wesley typed up a summary of his findings and emailed it to Kellard, knowing the police would need this information to understand what they were really dealing with. Then he tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't shut down, and he spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and thinking about 12 young women who'd driven down a highway and never made it to their destinations. The next morning, Wesley was back at the barracks before his shift officially started. Kellard had already reviewed Wesley's email and had pulled additional resources to begin a comprehensive review of all 12 missing persons cases. A conference room had been converted into a makeshift command center, with maps and photographs covering the walls and boxes of case files stacked on the table. Kellard looked like he hadn't slept much either, his eyes bloodshot and his face showing the strain of working a case that had suddenly exploded in scope from a single missing woman to a potential serial predator investigation. He waved Wesley into the room and gestured at the wall where photographs of all 12 missing women were displayed in a row. Your analysis was correct. We've been looking at this as 12 separate cases, but when you put them together like this, the pattern is undeniable. Same stretch of highway, same victim profile, same method of abandoning the vehicles. We've got a predator who's been operating in this area for at least 2 years, probably longer. Wesley studied the photographs, seeing the faces of young women who'd had their entire lives ahead of them. Women who'd made the mistake of driving down the wrong stretch of highway at the wrong time. Rebecca Pritchard smiled out from her photo, her eyes bright with the kind of optimism that comes from being young and believing the world is full of possibilities. Wesley thought about Patricia, about how that optimism had been destroyed when her daughter vanished, and how Patricia had spent the last 6 months trying to find answers in a swamp that didn't give up its secrets easily. Kellard continued, his voice grim. I've been in contact with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. They're sending a team down to review the cases and provide support. This is beyond our resources now. We need federal involvement. But in the meantime, we need to figure out where Patricia Holcomb went and whether her disappearance is connected to the same perpetrator. Wesley turned away from the photographs. She was searching for her daughter. Based on her notes, she'd been driving this route for months, watching traffic patterns, documenting vehicles she thought were suspicious. If she identified the perpetrator or got too close to something he wanted to keep hidden, he might have targeted her the same way he targeted the others. Kellard nodded slowly. That's my thinking too. But we have a problem. Patricia's vehicle was found at mile marker 68, which is right in the middle of the cluster zone. If she went into the swamp voluntarily because she saw something or was following a lead, we might never find her. That terrain is impossible to search completely. There are thousands of acres of wetland and hammocks where a body could be hidden and never recovered. And if she was taken by our perpetrator, he's had plenty of time to dispose of evidence. Sergeant Vance entered the room carrying a folder, his expression troubled. We just got something from Patricia Holcomb's phone records. She made several calls in the hours before her vehicle was abandoned, including one to a local number that belongs to a woman named Eula Mae Pritchard. That's Rebecca's grandmother, Patricia's mother. I've got contact information if you want to follow up. Kellard took the folder and scanned the contents. We need to talk to her. If Patricia communicated what she was doing or what she'd found, the grandmother might have information that could help us. Wesley spoke up before Kellard could assign someone else to the interview. I'd like to be there when you talk to her. I was the last law enforcement officer to see Patricia alive, and I want to help bring her home. Kellard studied Wesley for a moment, then nodded. All right, you're with me. Let's go. They drove to Eula Mae Pritchard's address, which turned out to be a modest mobile home in a quiet park on the outskirts of Naples, about 40 minutes from where they'd found Patricia's abandoned vehicle. The mobile home was well maintained with flower boxes in the windows and a small garden plot beside the concrete pad where it sat. An older woman, probably in her 70s, answered the door when Kellard knocked. She had gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. She looked at their uniforms and badges, and Wesley saw something crumble in her expression, as if she'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it at the same time. "You found her," Eula May said, her voice breaking. "You found Patricia." Kellard's voice was gentle but professional. "Ma'am, I'm Police Marvin Kellard, and this is Trooper Wesley Creighton. We're investigating your daughter Patricia's disappearance. May we come in and talk with you?" Eula May stepped aside and let them enter, leading them to a small living room that was crowded with photographs of family members at various stages of life. Wesley immediately spotted several pictures of a young woman he recognized as Rebecca Pritchard, smiling and healthy and alive. There were also more recent photographs showing Patricia with Rebecca, mother and daughter together at what looked like a graduation ceremony or birthday celebration. Eula May sat down heavily in an armchair and gestured for them to sit on the couch. "I knew something bad had happened. Patricia called me 2 nights ago, late, maybe around midnight. She was upset, talking fast, saying she'd found something important. She said she'd been watching a vehicle for weeks, following it, and she finally had proof." Kellard leaned forward, his attention sharpening. "What kind of proof? Did she tell you what vehicle she was following or who was driving it?" Eula May shook her head, wiping at her eyes with a tissue. "She didn't give me details, just said it was a truck. A white truck that she'd seen multiple times in the areas where those girls' cars were found. She said she'd gotten photographs of the license plate and had tracked where it went. She was excited but also scared. She told me she was going to follow the truck one more time to see where it led, and then she was going to take everything to the police. I begged her not to go alone. Told her to call you folks right then, but she said she needed to be sure first. She didn't want to waste anyone's time with false leads." Wesley felt his chest tighten with frustration and sadness. Patricia had been on the verge of breaking the case, had been following a suspect vehicle and gathering evidence, but she'd made the fatal mistake of trying to confront it alone rather than bringing in law enforcement. It was the kind of decision a desperate mother would make, driven by the need to find answers and unwilling to wait for official channels that had already failed her once. Kellard pulled out his notebook. "Did Patricia tell you anything else about this truck? Where she'd seen it? What time of day? Anything about the driver?" Eula May thought for a moment, clearly trying to remember through the haze of grief and fear. She said she'd seen it parked at the rest area on Interstate 75, the big one with the visitor center. She said it was always there late at night, between midnight and 3 in the morning, and that the driver would sit in the truck for hours just watching the traffic. She thought he was hunting, that's the word she used. She said he was hunting for girls who matched Rebecca's description, young women traveling alone. Wesley exchanged a glance with Kellard, and he could see the police was thinking the same thing. The rest area at mile marker 70 was the only significant facility along that entire stretch of Alligator Alley, and it was positioned right in the middle of the cluster zone where all the vehicles had been abandoned. It made sense as a hunting ground, a place where someone could observe traffic patterns, identify potential victims, and plan their attacks. Kellard's voice remained calm despite the urgency of the information. "Mrs. Pritchard, did Patricia mention if she had these photographs with her? Did she keep them in her car or upload them somewhere?" Eula May nodded slowly. She said she kept everything on her phone and had backed it up to a cloud storage account. She was very careful about that, said she didn't want to lose the evidence if something happened to her phone. Kellard immediately pulled out his own phone and made a call, presumably to get a warrant for Patricia's phone records and cloud storage. Wesley stayed with Eula May, trying to provide some measure of comfort even though he knew there was nothing he could say that would make this situation better. "Mrs. Pritchard, we're going to find out what happened to Patricia and to Rebecca. I promise you that." Eula May looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss. "My daughter spent 6 months living in her car, driving up and down that highway trying to find her baby girl. She stopped eating regular meals, stopped seeing friends, stopped living her life because all she could think about was finding Rebecca. And now she's gone too, and I've lost both of them. What kind of monster does this? What kind of person hunts young women like they're animals? Wesley had no answer for her because he'd been asking himself the same question. They spent another 30 minutes with Eula May, documenting everything she could remember about Patricia's phone call, and collecting any additional information that might be relevant to the investigation. When they finally left, Wesley felt the weight of 2 missing persons cases pressing down on him, and he was more determined than ever to find answers. Back at the command center, Kellard briefed the team on what they'd learned. The warrant for Patricia's phone records and cloud storage came through within hours, and a forensic technician began downloading and analyzing the data. What they found confirmed Eula May's account and provided crucial new evidence. Patricia's phone contained hundreds of photographs taken over several months, most of them showing a white commercial truck with a distinctive company logo on the side. The photographs were time-stamped and geotagged, showing the truck at various locations along Interstate 75, always at night, and frequently parked at the rest area near mile marker 70. Patricia had also documented the truck's license plate, and the forensic tech ran it immediately through the vehicle registration database. The truck was registered to a commercial landscaping company based in Fort Myers, and the listed driver was an employee named Curtis Ray Landrum, age 42, with an address in Lehigh Acres. A background check revealed that Landrum had a prior criminal record, including 2 arrests for voyeurism and 1 for attempted kidnapping that had been pleaded down to a lesser charge. He'd served 3 years in prison and had been out on parole for the past 18 months. The timing aligned perfectly with when the missing persons cases had begun to cluster in the Alligator Alley area. Kellard looked at the information, and then at Wesley, his expression hard. "We need to bring Landrum in for questioning immediately. If he's our guy, and Patricia confronted him or got too close, he might have taken her the same way he took the others." Wesley's pulse was racing now, the adrenaline of a breaking case mixing with the fear that they might already be too late. What about a search warrant for his residence and the truck? Kellard was already on the phone, coordinating with the state attorney's office. "Already in process. We'll have warrants within the hour. In the meantime, I want surveillance on Landrum's address. If he runs, we'll lose him." Within 2 hours, they had everything in place. A tactical team from the Collier County Sheriff's Office was positioned near Landrum's residence in Lehigh Acres, and additional units were ready to execute search warrants on both the house and the truck. Wesley and Kellard joined the team, and as the sun began to set on another oppressively hot Florida evening, they moved in. Landrum's house was a rundown, single-story structure on a dirt road surrounded by overgrown vegetation and chain-link fencing. The white commercial truck was parked in the driveway, and lights were visible inside the house. The tactical team approached with practiced precision, announcing their presence and ordering anyone inside to come out with their hands visible. There was a long moment of silence. Then the front door opened, and Curtis Ray Landrum stepped out. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a scraggly beard, wearing jeans and a stained t-shirt. His hands were empty and raised, and his expression was one of resignation rather than surprise, as if he'd been expecting this moment. He was taken into custody without resistance and transported to the Collier County Jail for questioning, while the search teams went to work on the house and truck. What they found in the first hour of searching was enough to turn Wesley's stomach and confirm their worst fears. In the truck's cargo bed hidden under landscaping equipment, they found several rolls of duct tape, zip ties, a taser, and a collection of women's jewelry that matched descriptions from several of the missing persons cases. In the house, they found a room that had been converted into what could only be described as a trophy collection. Photographs covered one wall, candid shots of young women who appeared to have been taken without their knowledge. Some of the faces matched the missing women from Patricia's list, and Wesley recognized Rebecca Pritchard among them. There were also personal items, driver's licenses, cell phones, articles of clothing, all organized and labeled with dates and locations. It was the collection of a predator who kept souvenirs of his victims, and the evidence was overwhelming. But they didn't find Patricia Holcomb, and they didn't find any of the missing women alive. The search continued through the night, with cadaver dogs brought in to search the property for burial sites, but the results were inconclusive. The property backed up to a canal that fed into the Everglades system, and Kellard's fear was that Landrum had been disposing of bodies in the water where they'd never be recovered. Wesley stood in Landrum's trophy room, surrounded by the faces of 12 young women who'd made the mistake of crossing paths with a monster, and he felt a rage building in him that he had to consciously suppress. This was the man who'd been hunting along Alligator Alley for 2 years, who'd targeted Patricia's daughter and then Patricia herself when she'd gotten too close to the truth. And now they had to extract a confession from him and find out where the bodies were. Because without that information, families like Eula Mae Pritchard would never have closure. The interrogation of Curtis Ray Landrum began at 0200 hours in a windowless room at the Collier County Sheriff's Office, and Wesley Creighton watched it unfold from behind the two-way mirror alongside Sergeant Vance and 2 FBI agents who'd arrived from the Tampa field office. Police Marvin Kellard sat across the table from Landrum, a folder containing photographs and evidence reports positioned between them, and the digital recorder's red light glowing steadily in the corner. Landrum had waived his right to an attorney, which surprised everyone, but his demeanor suggested he'd already accepted that his freedom was over and was now more interested in controlling the narrative than in mounting a defense. He sat calmly with his hands folded on the table, his expression neutral, and waited for Kellard to begin. Kellard opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table, images of the jewelry found in Landrum's truck and the trophy room discovered in his house. He let the silence stretch for a moment, watching Landrum's face for any reaction. When Landrum showed nothing, Kellard spoke in a measured tone that was neither aggressive nor sympathetic. "Curtis, we found these items in your possession. We've already matched some of them to missing persons cases going back 2 years. We have your DNA on file, and we're running it against evidence from multiple crime scenes. We have surveillance footage placing your truck at locations where several women were last seen. This isn't a question of whether you're involved, it's a question of how many victims there are and where we can find them. The only way you help yourself now is by being honest and giving these families closure." Landrum was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the photographs. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he was discussing something mundane rather than the destruction of human lives. "I didn't plan for it to go this way. It started as something else, just watching, following. I'd see these girls driving alone at night, and I'd wonder where they were going, what their stories were. It became a game, following them without them knowing, seeing how close I could get. But watching wasn't enough after a while. I needed more." Wesley felt his jaw clench as he listened. Landrum was describing the escalation pattern that every criminal profiler recognized, the progression from voyeurism to stalking to violence. The man had started by simply observing potential victims, feeding whatever twisted compulsion drove him, but eventually the thrill of watching had faded, and he'd needed to act on his impulses. Kellard kept his voice steady. "Tell me about the first one. Who was she and what happened?" Landrum's eyes drifted to the ceiling as if he was accessing a memory, and when he spoke again there was something almost nostalgic in his tone that made Wesley's skin crawl. "Her name was Sarah Jane Colfax. I saw her at a gas station near Ocala. She was traveling alone, looked tired. I followed her onto Interstate 75, kept back far enough that she wouldn't notice. When she started drifting between lanes, I knew she was falling asleep. I pulled up beside her and flashed my lights, made like I was trying to warn her about something wrong with her car. She pulled over, and I pulled over behind her. When she got out to check what I was pointing at, I used the taser. It was easy. Easier than I thought it would be. The casual way Landrum described the abduction, as if it was a simple task he'd completed rather than a violent crime against another human being, sent a wave of revulsion through everyone watching. Kellard maintained his professional composure, but Wesley could see the tension in the police's shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. "What did you do with her after you incapacitated her?" Landrum's expression remained neutral. "I put her in my truck and drove to a place I knew, an old access road that goes back into the Everglades near mile marker 63. No one uses it anymore. I kept her there for a while, talked to her, tried to understand why she'd been so careless driving alone at night. But she wouldn't stop screaming and fighting even after I explained I wasn't going to hurt her if she just stayed calm. Eventually, she tried to run, made it maybe 20 yards into the swamp before the water got too deep. I couldn't have her get away and tell someone, so I held her under until she stopped moving. The Everglades took care of the rest. Wesley had to step away from the mirror for a moment, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. Sarah Jane Colfax had been a 21-year-old nursing student driving home from visiting her parents when Curtis Ray Landrum had turned her into his first victim. She'd fought for her life in a swamp while a predator calmly explained his twisted logic, and then she'd been murdered and left to disappear into water and mud. Behind the mirror, one of the FBI agents was already on the phone coordinating search teams to the location Landrum had described. But everyone knew the chances of recovering remains after 20 months were minimal. The Everglades was efficient at erasing evidence. Bodies decomposed rapidly in the warm water and became food for alligators and other scavengers. Even if they found the location, there might be nothing left to recover. Kellard moved to the next photograph, a picture of Rebecca Lynn Pritchard taken from Patricia's missing persons printout. "Tell me about Rebecca." Landrum looked at the photograph for a longer moment this time, and something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite emotion, but there was a recognition there that suggested Rebecca had been different somehow. She was the one that made it complicated. I saw her at the rest area at mile marker 70. She'd pulled over to use the bathroom and get coffee from the vending machines. It was around 2 in the morning, and there was no one else around. I'd been watching the area for weeks by then, had developed a pattern. I'd park my truck and wait for girls traveling alone to stop. Most of them would be smart, wouldn't linger, would do their business and get back on the road. But Rebecca sat at one of the picnic tables for a while, looking at her phone, not paying attention to her surroundings. She made it easy. Kellard's voice hardened slightly. "You took her from the rest area?" Landrum shook his head. "Not directly. I followed her when she left, same pattern as before. I pulled up beside her and signaled that something was wrong with her car. She pulled over near mile marker 72, and I used the same method. Taser, then into my truck. But Rebecca was different. She didn't scream or fight like the others. She talked to me, asked me questions, tried to understand why I was doing this. She said her mother would be worried, that she had family who loved her. She made me see her as a person instead of just another girl driving alone." Wesley's hands were clenched into fists now. Rebecca had tried to humanize herself to her captor, had used empathy and connection to try to save her life. It was a survival technique that sometimes worked with certain types of criminals, but clearly it hadn't been enough to save her from Curtis Ray Landrum. Kellard leaned forward. "Did you kill her?" Landrum was quiet for a long time, long enough that Wesley thought he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke, his voice lower now. Yes, but it took longer. I kept her for 3 days at the access road location. I brought her food and water, kept her restrained but not hurt. I thought maybe if I could just talk to her, understand what made her think it was safe to travel alone at night, I could let her go. But she never stopped looking for ways to escape, never stopped trying to find weaknesses in how I'd secured her. On the 3rd day, she managed to get one hand free while I was sleeping and tried to run. I caught her before she made it to the main road, and I knew I couldn't keep her anymore. The longer I kept her, the more evidence there would be, so I did what I had to do. The room behind the mirror was silent except for the sound of breathing and the scratch of pens as the FBI agents took notes. Kellard's voice was carefully controlled when he spoke again. "Where is Rebecca's body?" Landrum gestured vaguely. "Same place as the others. The water takes them. I weighted her down with cinder blocks from my truck, but the gators and the current do the rest. You might find bones if you search long enough, but probably not. The Everglades doesn't give things back easily." Kellard moved through the remaining photographs, and over the next 2 hours, Landrum provided details about 8 more victims. He described their abductions with the same clinical detachment, explaining his methods and his reasoning as if he was walking someone through a recipe rather than confessing to multiple murders. Each story followed a similar pattern. Young women traveling alone at night, made vulnerable by fatigue or distraction, lured into stopping by Landrum's fake concern about their vehicle, then incapacitated and taken to remote locations in the Everglades where their screams couldn't be heard and their bodies would never be found. When Kellard finally placed a photograph of Patricia Ann Holcomb on the table, Wesley straightened up and moved closer to the mirror. This was the answer he'd been waiting for, the question that had been haunting him since he'd found Patricia's abandoned vehicle. Kellard's voice carried a new edge now. "Tell me about Patricia." Landrum looked at the photograph, and for the first time showed something that might have been regret, or perhaps just irritation at having been caught. She was the one who figured it out. I'd seen her at the rest area multiple times over several months. At first, I thought she was another potential target, but she never stayed long enough and she was always watching, always writing things down. Eventually, I realized she was watching me. She'd park on the far side of the lot where she thought I couldn't see her, and she'd photograph my truck. She was documenting me. Kellard nodded slowly. "Patricia was investigating you because you'd killed her daughter. She spent 6 months trying to find evidence to bring to the police." Landrum's jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't know Rebecca was her daughter until later. If I'd known, I might have been more careful. But by the time I realized Patricia was a threat, she'd already gathered too much information. 2 nights ago, she followed me when I left the rest area. I led her down to the old access road thinking I could lose her in the back roads, but she stayed with me. When we both stopped, she got out of her car and approached my truck. She had her phone out, was taking pictures, said she was calling the police right then. I couldn't let that happen." Wesley felt something cold settle in his chest. Patricia had been so close to ending this, had been moments away from calling for help, but Landrum had stopped her. Kellard's voice was quiet. "What did you do to her?" Landrum looked down at his hands. "I used the taser, same as always, loaded her into my truck and drove to a different location, deeper in the Everglades where even the airboats don't go. There's a sinkhole there, natural limestone formation that drops maybe 80 feet straight down into water. I weighted her the same way I weighted the others and dropped her in. She's not coming back." The words hit Wesley like a physical blow. Patricia Ann Holcomb had spent 6 months searching for her daughter, had gotten closer than any law enforcement agency to identifying the predator responsible. And in the end, she'd become another victim of the same man who'd taken Rebecca. Mother and daughter, both consumed by the Everglades. Both denied the dignity of a proper burial or the closure that comes from being found. Kellard gathered the photographs and closed the folder. You're going to take us to these locations. Every single one. We're going to recover whatever remains can be recovered, and we're going to give these families whatever closure is possible. Landrum nodded slowly. I'll show you where they are, but don't expect to find much. The swamp takes everything eventually. The interrogation ended, and Landrum was returned to his cell while the search teams prepared for what everyone knew would be a long and difficult process. Wesley stepped out of the observation room and walked down the hallway, needing air and space to process what he'd just heard. He found himself outside in the parking lot as the sun was beginning to rise, the sky turning from black to deep purple to orange, and he stared out toward the west where the Everglades waited, silent and indifferent to the human tragedies it had witnessed. Over the following weeks, Curtis Ray Landrum was transported under heavy guard to multiple locations throughout the Everglades, each one identified from his descriptions and Patricia's documentation. Search teams in airboats and full protective gear worked in oppressive heat and dangerous conditions, probing the water and mud for any trace of the 12 women who'd disappeared. They found fragments, bone fragments that had survived the scavengers and the decay, personal items that had been weighted down along with the bodies, enough physical evidence to confirm Landrum's confessions and provide some measure of proof for the families. At the sinkhole where Landrum claimed to have disposed of Patricia Holcomb, a specialized dive team went down into the dark water and found remains at the bottom, weighted with cinder blocks just as Landrum had described. The remains were recovered and identified through dental records as Patricia Ann Holcomb. Near the same location, searchers found additional remains that were identified as Rebecca Lynn Pritchard. Mother and daughter had ended up in the same watery grave, separated by months but united in death. Wesley attended both memorial services when the remains were released to the families. Eula Mae Pritchard sat in the front row at a small church in Naples, flanked by relatives who looked as hollowed out by grief as she did. She'd lost her granddaughter and her daughter to the same predator, and the weight of that loss was visible in every line of her face. When the service ended, Eula Mae approached Wesley in the parking lot, moving slowly as if each step required enormous effort. She looked up at him with eyes that had cried all their tears and had nothing left but emptiness. You tried to help her, Patricia, I mean. That night you stopped her. You tried to get her to stop searching. She told me about it when she called. Wesley's throat was tight. I should have done more. I should have recognized what she was doing and stopped her from going back out there. Eula Mae shook her head slowly. You couldn't have stopped her. Once Patricia knew what had happened to Rebecca, once she saw the pattern, nothing was going to keep her from searching. She spent 6 months driving that highway because she needed to know, needed to find her baby girl. And in the end, she did find her. They're together now. The words were meant to be comforting, but they just made Wesley feel worse. Patricia and Rebecca were together, but only because they'd both been murdered and thrown into the same sinkhole by a predator who'd been hunting along Alligator Alley for 2 years. Wesley had been patrolling that same stretch of highway the entire time, had driven past the rest area where Landrum had watched for victims countless times, had maybe even passed Landrum's truck without recognizing it as a threat. The weight of those missed opportunities and failed connections would stay with him long after this case was closed. Curtis Ray Landrum was charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, and numerous other felonies. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, accepting instead 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, he showed the same flat affect he'd displayed throughout the investigation, speaking only when the judge asked if he had anything to say to the families of his victims. I can't explain why I did what I did in a way that would make sense to you. Something in me was broken, and I acted on it. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, but I know that's not enough." The families sat silently, and several people walked out rather than listen to his words. Wesley attended the hearing in full uniform, standing at the back of the courtroom and watching as Landrum was led away in shackles to begin serving his sentences. It should have felt like justice, like closure, but it just felt empty. The case became national news for a brief period. Another story about a serial killer operating in plain sight. And then the media attention faded and moved on to other tragedies. Wesley returned to his regular patrol duties on Alligator Alley, working the same overnight shifts and covering the same stretches of highway where 12 women had lost their lives. But everything felt different now. Every vehicle he stopped, every welfare check he conducted, carried the weight of knowing what could be hidden beneath the surface of a routine traffic stop. He found himself being more thorough, asking more questions, pushing harder when something didn't feel right. Sergeant Vance noticed the change and pulled Wesley aside one evening before shift. "You're carrying this case with you. I can see it. What happened to those women and to Patricia Holcomb? That's not on you. You did everything you could with the information you had." Wesley wanted to believe that, but he kept replaying that first traffic stop with Patricia, kept thinking about the moment when she'd said she couldn't stop driving and he'd let her go. Maybe if he'd pushed harder, maybe if he'd taken her into protective custody for a psychiatric evaluation, she'd still be alive. Maybe if he'd asked the right questions or made the right connections, he could have identified Landrum before Patricia confronted him. The maybes and what-ifs were endless, and they didn't change the outcome, but Wesley couldn't let them go. Vance seemed to understand without Wesley having to explain. The job requires us to make judgment calls with incomplete information. Sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. You made reasonable decisions based on what you knew at the time. Patricia Holcomb made her own choices, and while those choices were driven by grief and desperation, they were still her choices. You can't take responsibility for that. Wesley nodded, but didn't trust himself to speak. They stood in silence for a moment, then Vance clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. Wesley climbed into his patrol cruiser and pulled out onto Interstate 75 as the sun set behind him, painting the Everglades in shades of orange and red. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark except for his headlights, and somewhere out there were the ghosts of 12 young women who'd driven this same road and never made it home. Wesley thought about Rebecca Pritchard, who'd tried to reason with her captor and had died anyway. He thought about Patricia Holcomb, who'd spent half a year searching for her daughter and had found only her own death. And he thought about Eula May Pritchard, who'd lost both of them and now lived with an emptiness that would never be filled. 3 months after Landrum's sentencing, Wesley was working a routine patrol when he spotted a vehicle drifting between lanes near mile marker 75, almost exactly where he'd first stopped Patricia. The pattern was familiar, the slight weaving that suggested distraction or fatigue, and Wesley pulled out to follow it. The vehicle was a small sedan, and as Wesley drew closer he could see a single occupant, a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s. He watched for a mile, documenting the drift pattern, then made the decision to initiate a traffic stop. When the sedan pulled over and Wesley approached the driver's window, he found himself looking at a tired young woman with red-rimmed eyes who immediately started crying when she saw his uniform. "I'm sorry, officer. I know I was weaving. I've been driving for 8 hours straight and I'm exhausted. I just wanted to get home." Wesley kept his voice gentle. "It's all right, ma'am. Let me see your license and registration, please." She handed over the documents with trembling hands, and Wesley checked them quickly. Everything was in order. No warrants, no red flags. He handed them back and made a decision. "Ma'am, there's a rest area about 3 miles ahead. I want you to drive there carefully, and I want you to rest for at least 2 hours before you continue your trip. Driving in this condition is dangerous for you and for everyone else on the road. I'm going to follow you to make sure you get there safely." The young woman looked surprised, then relieved. "Thank you. I will, I promise." Wesley followed her to the rest area, watched as she parked and locked her doors, then sat in his cruiser nearby for the next 2 hours, making sure she was safe. When she finally woke up and started her engine to continue her journey, she waved at him gratefully as she pulled back onto the highway. Wesley watched her taillights disappear into the distance, and for the first time since the Landrum case had closed, he felt like he'd done something right. He couldn't bring back the 12 women who died, couldn't undo Patricia Holcomb's desperate search or Eula Mae Pritchard's unbearable loss, but he could make sure that one more young woman made it home safely, and in the long dark stretches of Alligator Alley, where the ghosts still whispered in the sawgrass, maybe that was enough. The highway stretched ahead into the darkness, waiting with its secrets and its dangers, and Wesley Creighton drove on into the night, still searching for the balance between what had been lost and what could still be saved. The Everglades kept its silence, and the road continued, endless and unforgiving, taking what it wanted and giving nothing back. The thing about working the forest roads in Central Florida is that you never really know what you're going to find when you venture off the main highways. Trooper Harlan Duvall had learned this truth over his 9 years with the Florida Highway Patrol, most of them spent covering the rural routes that cut through Ocala National Forest and the surrounding Marion County wilderness. The forest was a sprawling 400,000-acre expanse of pine and scrub oak, swamps and springs, crossed by narrow 2-lane roads that saw more wildlife than human traffic on most days. It was beautiful in its own way, wild and untamed, but it was also unforgiving to anyone who didn't respect its dangers. People got lost in the Ocala forest regularly, hikers who wandered off marked trails, campers who ventured too deep into the backcountry, and occasionally someone running from something who thought the wilderness would hide them better than any urban environment could. It was early September 2021, and the late summer heat still pressed down on everything like a wet blanket, making the air thick and hard to breathe, even with the cruiser's air conditioning running at full blast. Harlan had clocked in at the Marion County Barracks in Ocala at 1400 hours, gone through his standard vehicle inspection with the kind of attention to detail that came from years of habit, and pulled out onto State Road 40, heading east into the forest just after 1430. The radio had been relatively quiet all afternoon, just a few routine traffic stops and one accident on the interstate that other units had already handled. Harlan liked the quiet shifts. They gave him time to think and to appreciate the landscape he'd spent nearly a decade protecting. The forest was different from the urban areas where most troopers worked. Out here, you dealt with different problems and different people, and you learned quickly that backup could be 20 minutes away or more if something went wrong. Around 1700 hours, just as the sun was beginning its descent towards the tree line and casting long shadows across the road, dispatch came over the radio with a call that immediately caught Harlan's attention. All units in the vicinity of State Road 19 north of the Ocklawaha River. We have a report of a vehicle off the road, possibly as a result of storm damage from last night's weather. Caller reports the vehicle appears to have been there for several hours and may have occupants trapped inside. Requesting welfare check and possible rescue response. Harlan grabbed the mic before any other unit could respond, his mind already calculating distances and routes. Dispatch, Unit 42 responding. I'm approximately 15 miles south of that location on State Road 40. I can take Forest Road 88 north and intersect with State Road 19. ETA 20 minutes. Dispatch acknowledged, and Harlan made a U-turn, heading back west toward the Forest Road turnoff. The previous night had indeed brought severe weather to the area, one of those violent Florida thunderstorms that rolled in from the Gulf with little warning and dumped inches of rain in a matter of hours. The storm had knocked out power in several areas and had brought down trees across multiple roads, keeping maintenance crews busy all day clearing debris. Harlan had worked part of the overnight shift dealing with storm-related calls, and he'd seen firsthand how dangerous the conditions had been. Flash flooding in low-lying areas, wind strong enough to snap branches and send them through windshields, and lightning strikes that had started several small brush fires before the rain extinguished them. If a vehicle had gone off the road during that storm, the occupants could be seriously injured or trapped. Harlan turned onto Forest Road 88, a narrow dirt and gravel track that wound through dense pine forest and palmetto scrub. The road was rough, rutted from the previous night's rain, and Harlan had to slow his cruiser to navigate the worst sections. Overhead, the pine canopy filtered the late afternoon sunlight into a dim green twilight that made it feel later than it actually was. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling to each other, insects buzzing in the humid air, and somewhere in the distance the low grunt of a wild pig moving through the underbrush. Harlan kept his windows up despite the heat. Experience had taught him that the bugs would swarm into the vehicle given any opportunity, and he'd rather deal with the recycled air conditioning than spend his shift covered in mosquito bites. After about 12 minutes on Forest Road 88, Harlan reached the intersection with State Road 19, a slightly wider paved road that served as one of the main north-south routes through the forest. He turned north and began scanning the shoulders and tree line for any sign of the reported vehicle. State Road 19 was known for being dangerous during storms. The road followed the contours of the land and had several sections where water would pool and create hydroplaning hazards, and there were numerous places where the shoulder dropped off steeply into drainage ditches or ravines. Harlan had worked multiple accidents on this road over the years, most of them single-vehicle crashes where someone had taken a curve too fast or had lost control in wet conditions. About 3 miles north of the Forest Road 88 intersection, Harlan spotted it. Fresh tire tracks in the mud leading from the paved road across the shoulder and down a steep embankment into the tree line. Harlan pulled over and activated his overhead lights, then keyed the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 42 on scene at State Road 19 approximately 3 miles north of Forest Road 88. I have visible tire tracks leading off the roadway into heavy vegetation. I'm going to investigate on foot." Dispatch acknowledged, and Harlan stepped out of his cruiser, immediately feeling the humidity wrap around him like a physical presence. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight even though there was still some daylight left, knowing that under the forest canopy it would be significantly darker, and began carefully making his way down the embankment following the tire tracks. The slope was steep and slick with mud, and Harlan had to grab onto branches and small trees to keep from sliding. The tire tracks were clear, deep gouges in the soft earth that showed where a vehicle had left the road at speed and plowed down through the undergrowth. About 30 feet down the slope, Harlan found the vehicle. It was a large commercial semi-truck, the cab tilted at a severe angle with the passenger side wedged against a massive pine tree. The trailer had jackknifed during the crash and was resting partially in a drainage ditch that was still flowing with runoff from the previous night's storm. The truck was dark green with faded lettering on the side that Harlan couldn't make out clearly through the mud and vegetation that covered it. Harlan approached cautiously, his hand instinctively checking that his service weapon was secure. The cab's windshield was shattered, spider-webbed with cracks but still mostly intact, and he could see movement inside. Someone was alive in there. Harlan called out, projecting his voice over the sound of rushing water and wind in the trees. "Florida Highway Patrol, can you hear me? I'm coming to help." There was a response, muffled and weak, but definitely human. Harlan moved closer to the driver's side door which was the high side of the tilted cab, and tried the handle. It was jammed, either from the impact or from the way the frame had twisted. Harlan pulled harder, and the door finally gave way with a screech of metal, swinging open and revealing the interior. The driver was a man, probably in his 50s or 60s, with a weathered face and graying hair matted with blood from a cut on his forehead. He was conscious, but clearly disoriented, his eyes struggling to focus on Harlan. His right leg was pinned between the seat and the crumpled dashboard, and his left arm hung at an awkward angle that suggested it was broken. The cab smelled like diesel fuel and something else, something chemical that Harlan couldn't immediately identify. The driver tried to speak, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "Stuck. Been here since last night. Thought no one was going to find me." Harlan assessed the situation quickly. The driver was trapped and injured, but conscious and breathing. The bigger concern was the smell of fuel and the unstable position of the truck. If the vehicle shifted, or if there was a spark, the whole thing could go up in flames. Harlan keyed his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, Unit 42. I have one victim trapped in the cab of a commercial semi. Male driver, conscious but with visible injuries including a head wound and what appears to be a broken arm. Left leg is pinned. I'm going to need fire rescue, EMS, and heavy extraction equipment. Be advised the vehicle is in an unstable position and there's a strong smell of diesel fuel. We need to move fast." Dispatch confirmed and began coordinating the response. Harlan turned his attention back to the driver, trying to keep him calm and assess the extent of his injuries. "Sir, I'm Trooper Harlan Duvall with the Highway Patrol. Help is on the way. Can you tell me your name?" The driver blinked slowly, trying to focus. "Roscoe? Roscoe Ledger. I drive for Bartow Freight out of Tampa." Harlan made a mental note of the name and company. "Roscoe, can you tell me what happened? How did you end up off the road?" Roscoe's breathing was labored, each word seeming to cost him effort. "Storm last night. Came out of nowhere. Rain so heavy I couldn't see the road. I slowed down, but then there was water across the pavement. Deep water. I hit it and lost control. Truck started sliding and I couldn't stop it. Went off the road and down the hill. Hit that tree and everything went black for a while." Harlan nodded. The story matched what he'd seen at dozens of storm-related accidents. "Have you been conscious this whole time? Since last night?" Roscoe shook his head weakly. "I come and go. Wake up, pass out, wake up again. My leg hurts real bad. Think it might be broke." Harlan shined his flashlight on Roscoe's pinned leg and saw that the man was probably right. The leg was bent at an unnatural angle where it was trapped, and there was significant swelling visible even through his jeans. "We're going to get you out of here, Roscoe. The fire department is on the way with equipment to lift the dashboard and free your leg. Just try to stay still and stay calm." Roscoe's eyes drifted closed for a moment, then opened again. "My cargo. You need to check my cargo." Harlan frowned. "Your cargo? What are you hauling?" Roscoe's voice dropped even lower, and Harlan had to lean closer to hear him. "Electronics. High-value electronics. Company load, supposed to deliver to Jacksonville this morning. But something ain't right about it. I tried to tell dispatch before the storm hit, but I lost cell service." Harlan felt a prickle of concern. "What do you mean, something isn't right about it?" Roscoe's breathing was getting more labored, and Harlan could see him struggling to stay focused. "The manifest don't match what's actually in the trailer. I checked when I loaded up in Tampa. They told me not to look, said it was above my pay grade, but I looked anyway. Whatever's back there, it ain't just electronics." Before Harlan could ask more questions, Roscoe's eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness. Harlan checked his pulse. It was present but weak, and his breathing had become shallow. Harlan keyed his radio again. Dispatch, patient is going into shock. I need EMS here now, and I need them staged as close as possible. Also, be advised the driver has indicated there may be irregularities with the truck's cargo. I'm going to check the trailer once I've stabilized the patient. Dispatch acknowledged with a note of concern in the dispatcher's voice. Irregularities in cargo could mean anything from paperwork errors to smuggling operations, and Harlan knew he'd need to treat this scene as potentially criminal rather than just a traffic accident. Harlan heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer, and within minutes the first rescue units arrived. Firefighters from the Ocala Fire Department came down the embankment with extraction equipment, and paramedics followed with medical gear and a stretcher. Harlan briefed them on Roscoe's condition and the fuel hazard, then stepped back to let them work. The extraction took nearly 40 minutes, carefully using hydraulic tools to lift the dashboard enough to free Roscoe's trapped leg without causing further injury or destabilizing the truck. Once he was freed, the paramedics immobilized him on a backboard and carried him up the embankment to the waiting ambulance. Harlan watched them go, then turned his attention to the trailer. It was still partially submerged in the drainage ditch, and the rear doors were above water but covered in mud and debris. Harlan made his way around the wreckage, carefully testing his footing on the slippery ground, and examined the trailer's exterior. It was a standard enclosed trailer, maybe 40 feet long, with no windows or external markings beyond the faded Bartow Freight logo. The rear doors had a heavy padlock securing them, and Harlan noted that the lock looked new and significantly more substantial than what you'd typically see on a commercial freight trailer. That alone was enough to raise questions. Harlan pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the lock and the trailer's exterior, documenting everything before he proceeded. He then called dispatch. Dispatch Unit 42. The driver has been extracted and is en route to the hospital. I'm about to inspect the trailer cargo. Driver indicated there were irregularities with the manifest. I'm going to need a supervisor out here and possibly a K-9 unit if one is available. Dispatch confirmed and said a supervisor was already en route. Harlan decided to wait before attempting to open the trailer. This was potentially a crime scene, and he wanted to handle it by the book. He climbed back up to his cruiser and retrieved his incident report forms, beginning to document the scene while he waited for backup. About 20 minutes later, a Florida Highway Patrol supervisor arrived in an unmarked SUV. It was Lieutenant Vance, a veteran officer Harlan had worked with numerous times over the years. Vance was in his 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and decades of experience dealing with everything from routine traffic enforcement to major criminal investigations. He made his way down the embankment with the careful steps of someone who'd been in the field long enough to know when to take his time, and joined Harlan beside the trailer. "What have we got, Duval?" Harlan walked him through the situation from the initial crash report to Roscoe Ledger's statements about irregularities in the cargo. Vance listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the trailer and taking in the details. When Harlan finished, Vance pulled out a pair of bolt cutters from his equipment bag. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He positioned the cutters on the padlock and applied pressure. The lock was heavy-duty, but the cutters eventually sheared through, and the lock fell away. Vance pulled the doors open, and both men stepped back slightly, not sure what to expect. The interior of the trailer was dimly lit by the failing daylight filtering through the open doors, but Harlan could immediately see that this was no ordinary freight load. The trailer was packed with boxes, but they weren't labeled with any company names or shipping information. Instead, they were plain cardboard boxes sealed with excessive amounts of packing tape. Vance pulled out his flashlight and shined it deeper into the trailer. "This doesn't look like a legitimate commercial load," Harlan agreed. Roscoe said the manifest didn't match what was actually loaded. He said someone told him not to look. Vance climbed up into the trailer and carefully opened one of the nearest boxes using a knife to slice through the tape. Inside were dozens of small packages wrapped in plastic, each one about the size of a brick. Vance pulled one out and examined it closely, then looked back at Harlan with a grim expression. This isn't electronics. This is narcotics, probably cocaine or heroin based on the packaging. And if the whole trailer is loaded like this, we're looking at a massive quantity. Harlan felt his pulse quicken. What had started as a routine accident rescue had just become a major drug interdiction case. We need to secure this scene immediately and call in DEA. Vance was already on his radio, calling for additional units and notifying the Marion County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration. Within the hour, the narrow forest road was crowded with law enforcement vehicles, and a perimeter had been established around the crash site. Agents from the DEA arrived and took over the inspection of the trailer's contents, methodically documenting and cataloging what turned out to be over 2,000 pounds of cocaine with a street value in the tens of millions of dollars. It was one of the largest drug seizures in Central Florida history, and it had been hidden in plain sight as a commercial freight shipment. As the sun set and portable lights were brought in to illuminate the scene, Harlan stood with Vance watching the operation unfold. The veteran lieutenant shook his head slowly. That driver, Roscoe Ledger, he may have just stumbled into the middle of something much bigger than a freight job. If this load belongs to a major cartel operation, and Roscoe knew about the irregularities, there are going to be people looking for answers about what happened to their product. Harlan felt a chill despite the warm evening air. You think Roscoe's in danger? Vance's expression was dark. I think we need to get a protection detail on him at the hospital immediately. And I think we need to find out exactly who hired him for this run and who was supposed to receive the delivery in Jacksonville. Because whoever they are, they just lost a fortune, and they're going to want someone to pay for it. The hospital in Ocala was a sprawling complex on the north side of town, and by the time Harlan Duvall arrived there around 2200 hours, a protective detail had already been established outside Roscoe Ledger's room. 2 Marion County Sheriff's deputies were stationed in the hallway, and a plainclothes officer from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was coordinating with hospital security to monitor all entrances and exits. Harlan had been ordered by Lieutenant Vance to interview Roscoe as soon as the doctors cleared him for questioning, and to get as much information as possible about who had hired him for the drug run and what he knew about the operation. The DEA agents who'd taken over the scene at the crash site were already working their own angles, running the truck's registration and the Bartow Freight Company through federal databases. But Roscoe was the key to understanding how a commercial driver had ended up transporting millions of dollars worth of cocaine through the Ocala National Forest. Harlan checked in with the deputies and then spoke with the FDLE officer, a lean man in his 40s named Rick Talmadge, who had the tired eyes of someone who'd been working organized crime cases for too long. Talmadge briefed Harlan on Roscoe's medical condition. He'd undergone surgery to repair his broken leg and had sustained a moderate concussion along with various cuts and bruises, but he was stable and conscious. The doctors had cleared him for a brief interview as long as it didn't cause undue stress or exhaust him. Talmadge walked Harlan to the door of Roscoe's room and spoke quietly. He's been asking for law enforcement since he woke up from surgery. Says he needs to tell someone what he knows before it's too late. He's scared, and honestly he should be. The amount of product we found in that trailer suggests this is a major cartel operation, probably out of Miami or the Gulf Coast. If they find out their shipment was seized and their driver is talking to police, they'll send people to clean up loose ends. Harlan felt the weight of that statement settle on him. This wasn't just about recovering drugs anymore. It was about protecting a witness who'd stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. Harlan entered the room and found Roscoe propped up in bed, his right leg in a cast elevated on pillows, his left arm in a sling, and an IV line running into his uninjured arm. His face was pale and drawn, the cut on his forehead now stitched and bandaged, and his eyes carried a fear that Harlan recognized immediately. This was a man who understood he was in serious danger. Roscoe looked at Harlan's uniform and managed a weak smile. "You're the trooper who pulled me out of that truck. I remember your voice, thank you for that." Harlan pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I'm Trooper Harlan Duvall. I'm glad you're going to be okay, Mr. Ledger. I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you some questions about what you were hauling and who hired you for that run. Whatever you can tell us will help keep you safe and help us shut down whoever's behind this operation." Roscoe nodded slowly, wincing as the movement caused pain somewhere in his battered body. "I'll tell you everything I know, but you gotta understand, I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought it was a legitimate freight job. I've been driving trucks for 30 years, never had so much as a speeding ticket. I'm not a criminal." Harlan pulled out his notepad. "I believe you. Start from the beginning. How did you get hired for this particular job?" Roscoe took a breath and began talking, his voice strained but steady. "About 2 weeks ago, I got a call from a dispatcher I'd never worked with before. Said his name was Dale Kirby, and he worked for Bartow Freight, which is a company I'd done a couple of legitimate runs for in the past. Nothing unusual about that. Freight companies use different dispatchers all the time. Kirby said they had a high-priority load that needed to go from Tampa to Jacksonville. Electronics and computer equipment for a tech company. Said it paid double the normal rate because it was time-sensitive and they needed someone reliable. I jumped at it because the money was good and I needed the work." Harlan made notes as Roscoe talked. "Did you meet this Dale Kirby in person, or was everything done over the phone?" Roscoe shook his head. "Never met him face to face. Everything was phone calls and text messages. He sent me the pickup address in Tampa, told me to be there at 0600 hours 3 days ago. When I got there, it was a warehouse in an industrial area, nothing suspicious about the location itself. But when I backed up to the loading dock, the guys loading the truck wouldn't let me see what they were putting in the trailer. They said it was company policy for high-value loads, that drivers weren't supposed to be involved in the loading process for security reasons. That struck me as odd, but I figured maybe it was just how this particular company operated." Harlan leaned forward. "But you checked the cargo anyway. You told me at the crash site that the manifest didn't match what was actually loaded." Roscoe's expression turned guilty. "Yeah, I did. After they finished loading and gave me the sealed manifest, I drove about 20 miles north and pulled over at a rest stop. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The guys at the warehouse were too nervous, too secretive. So I broke the seal on the trailer and looked inside. That's when I saw those boxes, hundreds of them, all plain cardboard with no labels or shipping information. I opened one and saw the plastic-wrapped packages. I've seen enough crime shows to know what that looked like." Harlan kept his voice even. "What did you do when you realized what you were hauling?" Roscoe's hands clenched on the hospital blanket. "I panicked. I tried calling the dispatcher, this Kirby guy, but he didn't answer. I tried calling the Bartow Freight main office, but it was early and no one was there yet. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police right then, but I was scared I'd be arrested for transporting drugs, even though I didn't know what I was carrying when I picked it up. So I made a stupid decision. I decided to drive to Jacksonville and try to figure out who I was supposed to deliver to, thinking maybe I could get evidence and then go to the authorities. But then the storm hit last night when I was going through the Ocala forest and I went off the road before I could do anything." Harlan understood the fear that had driven Roscoe's decision. even if it wasn't the right choice. A lot of people in Roscoe's position would have done the same thing, caught between the terror of being implicated in a crime and the uncertainty of how to extract themselves from the situation. "Do you still have your phone?" The one with the text messages from Dale Kirby. Roscoe gestured weakly toward the small closet where his personal belongings were stored. "It should be in my jacket pocket. They brought my stuff from the truck when the ambulance took me." Harlan retrieved the phone, a basic smartphone with a cracked screen, and found it still had enough battery to power on. He scrolled through the text messages and found the conversation with a contact labeled Dale Kirby Dispatch. The messages were brief and professional: pickup address, delivery instructions, and a few confirmations about timing. Harlan photographed the messages with his own phone, then handed Roscoe's phone to Officer Talmadge, who'd entered the room. "We'll need this for evidence. DEA is going to want to trace these numbers and see if they can identify who was actually behind the communications." Roscoe nodded, then his expression grew more troubled. "There's something else. The delivery address I was given, it wasn't a business or a warehouse. It was just coordinates, GPS coordinates for a location somewhere off Interstate 10 east of Jacksonville. Kirby told me someone would meet me there at a specific time and take possession of the trailer. That's when I really knew something was wrong. Legitimate freight deliveries don't work that way." Harlan felt a chill run down his spine. The operation was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought. Using GPS coordinates instead of physical addresses made it harder to trace and provided flexibility to change meeting locations if something went wrong. "Do you remember the coordinates?" Roscoe closed his eyes, thinking, "I wrote them down on a piece of paper in the truck's cab. I don't remember them exactly, but they should still be there if the paper survived the crash." Harlan made a note to have the crash site team search the cab more thoroughly for any documentation. He asked Roscoe several more questions about whether he'd noticed anyone following him during the drive, whether he'd made any stops where someone might have seen him checking the cargo, and whether he'd told anyone else what he'd discovered. Roscoe answered each question as thoroughly as his exhausted state would allow, but it became clear that he'd been operating alone and hadn't shared his concerns with anyone until after the crash. That was probably what had kept him alive so far. If the people behind the drug shipment thought Roscoe was just an unwitting driver who'd been in an accident, they might not see him as an immediate threat. But once they learned the cargo had been seized and Roscoe was talking to law enforcement, that calculus would change dramatically. After about 30 minutes, a nurse came in and informed Harlan that Roscoe needed to rest. Harlan thanked Roscoe for his cooperation and assured him that the protection detail would remain in place. As he left the room, Talmadge pulled him aside in the hallway. DEA ran the phone number that Kirby was using to text Roscoe. It's a burner purchased with cash at a convenience store in Miami 2 weeks ago. They're pulling surveillance footage from the store, but it's probably going to be a dead end. These operations are too smart to leave that kind of trail. The Bartow Freight Company is a different story, though. It's a legitimate business, been operating out of Tampa for 15 years. The owner had no knowledge of this shipment and says he's never heard of anyone named Dale Kirby working as a dispatcher. Someone used the company's name and reputation to give the operation a veneer of legitimacy. Harlan processed the information. So whoever set this up knew enough about the freight industry to make it look convincing to a driver like Roscoe. Talmadge nodded. Exactly. And they were counting on Roscoe not asking too many questions. Most drivers just pick up and deliver. They don't inspect cargo unless there's an obvious problem. Roscoe's decision to check the trailer probably saved his life in a way, because now he's a witness who can help us build a case. But it also puts him in serious danger. Harlan looked back at the closed door of Roscoe's hospital room. How long can we keep him protected? He can't stay in the hospital forever, and once he's released, he's going to be vulnerable. Talmadge's expression was grim. DEA is working on getting him into witness protection, but that takes time and paperwork. In the meantime, we keep him here under guard and hope that whoever's behind this doesn't move faster than we can." The two men stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the precarious situation. Then Talmadge's phone rang, and he answered it with a terse greeting. Harlan watched as Talmadge's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. When he ended the call, he looked at Harlan with urgent eyes. That was the DEA agent coordinating the crash site investigation. They just found something in the woods about 100 yards from where the truck went off the road. A campsite, recent, with evidence that someone's been watching that section of State Road 19. Harlan felt his pulse quicken. Someone was watching the road, watching for Roscoe's truck. Talmadge started walking toward the elevator, gesturing for Harlan to follow. "That's what it looks like. They found a tent, binoculars, a portable radio scanner tuned to law enforcement frequencies, and a logbook documenting vehicle traffic on that road for the past week. Whoever set up that camp was conducting surveillance, and based on the timing, they were probably there when Roscoe crashed, which means they know the truck went off the road, and they may know we've seized the cargo." Harlan followed Talmadge into the elevator, his mind racing through the implications. If they were watching and they saw the accident happen, why didn't they try to recover the drugs right away? Why wait? Talmadge pressed the button for the ground floor. Could be they were waiting to see if Roscoe survived and what he told us. Could be they were waiting for orders from whoever's running the operation. Or could be they're still out there in the forest watching and planning their next move. Either way, we need to get back out there and find out who was in that camp and where they went. The elevator doors opened, and the two men walked quickly through the hospital lobby and out to the parking lot where their vehicles were waiting. Harlan called Lieutenant Vance to update him on the situation and received clearance to return to the crash site and assist with the expanded investigation. Vance also informed him that additional resources were being mobilized, including a specialized tracking unit from the Florida Forest Service and a K-9 team trained in tracking human scent through wilderness terrain. The drive back to the crash site took about 40 minutes, and by the time Harlan arrived, the scene had transformed into a major law enforcement operation. Portable floodlights had been set up throughout the area, illuminating the crashed truck and the surrounding forest with harsh white light that made everything look stark and surreal. DEA agents in tactical gear were combing through the vegetation, documenting evidence and searching for any additional clues. A command post had been established near the road, with maps and communication equipment spread across folding tables, and a Forest Service ranger in a dark green uniform was briefing a group of officers about the terrain and the best approaches for tracking through the dense forest. Harlan recognized the ranger as Clint Raines, a man he'd worked with on several search and rescue operations over the years. Clint was in his 50s, with a weathered face and the kind of lean, hard build that came from spending most of your life outdoors. He knew the Ocala National Forest better than anyone Harlan had ever met, could read tracks and signs that most people wouldn't even notice, and had an almost supernatural ability to navigate through terrain that would leave others hopelessly lost. Clint saw Harlan approaching and waved him over to the map table. "Duval, good to see you. The situation just got a whole lot more complicated." Harlan joined him at the table, looking down at the topographical map spread out with several locations marked in red. "I heard you found a surveillance camp." Clint nodded and pointed to a spot on the map about 100 yards northeast of the crash site. "Right here, tucked into a thick palmetto stand with good sight lines to the road. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. The camp was well concealed, wouldn't have found it except one of the DEA agents spotted fresh footprints leading away from the crash site and followed them. The camp looks like it was occupied for at least a week, maybe longer. They had supplies, water, food, and enough equipment to suggest this was a serious surveillance operation, not just someone camping. Harlan studied the map. Any indication of where the person went after they left the camp? Clint's expression turned troubled. That's where it gets interesting. The footprints lead east from the camp, deeper into the forest. They're fresh, probably made within the last 12 hours. We've got a tracking team following them now, but the terrain gets real rough in that direction. Lots of swamp and thick undergrowth. If someone's trying to hide or escape, they picked a good route. Harlan looked at the vast expanse of green on the map representing the Ocala National Forest. 400,000 acres of wilderness, most of it undeveloped and inaccessible except on foot. If someone wanted to disappear, this was the place to do it. You think they're still out there, or did they make it to a road and get picked up? Clint traced a line on the map with his finger. Nearest road to the east is Forest Road 77, about 6 miles from the camp. If they were moving fast and knew the terrain, they could have reached it in 3 or 4 hours. But if they're not experienced in this environment, they could be lost and going in circles. We've had people die of exposure and dehydration in this forest because they got disoriented and couldn't find their way out. Even in September, the heat and humidity can kill you if you're not prepared. A DEA agent approached the table, a young woman in tactical gear with mud on her boots and a serious expression. We've processed the camp and collected everything that might be evidence. Found a few things you'll want to see. She laid out several plastic evidence bags on the table. One contained a small notebook with handwritten entries. Another held a commercial radio scanner, and a third contained what looked like a satellite phone. Clint picked up the bag with the notebook and examined it through the plastic. This is good. If they were documenting their surveillance, there might be information about who they were reporting to or what their objectives were. The DEA agent nodded. We're going to need to process all of this at the lab, but from what I could see, the notebook has dates, times, and vehicle descriptions. Looks like they were tracking not just Roscoe's truck, but all traffic on that stretch of road. Could be they were watching for law enforcement activity too, making sure their route was clean. Harlan felt a growing sense that they were dealing with something much larger than a single drug shipment. This sounds like a professional operation with significant resources and planning. The agent agreed. That's our assessment too. The amount of cocaine we found in that trailer, the sophisticated surveillance, the use of a legitimate trucking company as cover, all of it points to a major trafficking organization, probably one with connections to international cartels. We're coordinating with our offices in Miami and along the Gulf Coast to see if this matches any ongoing investigations. As they talked, a K9 handler approached with a large German shepherd on a lead. The dog was alert and focused, ears forward and body tense. The handler spoke to Clint. "Ranger Rains, we've got a solid scent track from the camp heading east into the swamp. My dog's ready to go if you want to start the pursuit now." Clint looked at Harlan. "You up for a hike through the forest at night? Could be we're tracking someone dangerous, and I'd rather have law enforcement with me than go alone." Harlan didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Let's find out who was watching that road and what they know." The group assembled quickly. Harlan, Clint Rains, the K9 handler and his dog, and 2 DEA agents. They equipped themselves with night vision gear, GPS units, and enough water and supplies for several hours in the field. Lieutenant Vance arrived just as they were preparing to move out and pulled Harlan aside. "Duval, you're not required to go on this tracking operation. We've got specialized units that can handle it." Harlan shook his head. "With respect, sir, I know this forest almost as well as Ranger Rains does, and I've been on this case from the beginning. I want to see it through." Vance studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay in constant radio contact. If the situation becomes dangerous, you pull back and wait for tactical support. Understood?" Harlan confirmed, then joined the tracking team as they moved into the forest. following the K9 as it picked up the scent trail and began leading them east into the darkness. The forest at night was a different world from what Harlan was used to patrolling during daylight hours. The sounds were amplified, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves making him turn and scan with his flashlight. The humidity seemed even more oppressive without the sun to evaporate the moisture, and within minutes Harlan's uniform was soaked with sweat. The K9 moved with purpose, nose to the ground and occasionally lifting its head to test the air. The handler kept up a steady commentary, interpreting the dog's body language and explaining what they were tracking. Scent is strong and fresh. Single person, male, based on the stride length we're seeing in the tracks. He's moving fast, but not running. Suggests he knows where he's going, or at least has a destination in mind. They pushed through palmetto scrub and around stands of pine, the ground alternating between dry sandy soil and muddy patches where water collected. After about 2 miles, the terrain began to change, becoming wetter and more swamp-like. The K9 slowed, working more carefully now as the scent became dispersed by standing water. Clint Rains, who'd been navigating using a handheld GPS unit, stopped and consulted his map. We're entering one of the low-lying areas that floods regularly. If our guy went into this water, the scent trail is going to be much harder to follow. The dog can still track him, but it'll be slower. The K9 handler let his dog work the edge of the water, and after a few minutes the dog indicated a direction, pulling toward the north. They followed, wading through ankle-deep water that was warm and dark, alive with the movement of things they couldn't see. Harlan kept his hand near his service weapon, hyper-aware that they were tracking someone who might be armed and desperate. After another mile of difficult terrain, the forest opened up slightly and they found themselves at the edge of a small clearing. The K9 stopped and alerted, its body going rigid and a low growl rumbling in its chest. The K9 handler immediately pulled his dog back and signaled for the team to stop. Everyone froze, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the clearing ahead through the darkness and the filtered moonlight that barely penetrated the forest canopy. Harlan Duvall felt his heart hammering in his chest as he moved his flashlight beam slowly across the open space, looking for any sign of movement or threat. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, surrounded by thick vegetation and palmetto stands that could hide someone easily. In the center of the clearing was what looked like an old hunting camp, a ramshackle wooden structure with a sagging roof and walls made of weathered planks. There was no light visible from inside. No smoke from a chimney or fire pit. But the K9's alert made it clear that their target had come through this area recently and might still be nearby. Clint Rains moved up beside Harlan and spoke in a whisper barely audible over the night sounds of the forest. That's the old Parsons camp. Been abandoned for maybe 20 years. Used to be a hunting cabin back when this area was less regulated. Most people don't even know it's here anymore. Harlan kept his voice equally low. Is there any other way out of this clearing besides the way we came in? Clint nodded and pointed to the far side of the clearing. There's an old trail that leads north toward Forest Road 77, about 4 miles from here. If someone knows about it, they could use it to reach the road and get picked up, but the trail's overgrown and hard to follow in daylight. Nearly impossible at night unless you've got GPS or really know the terrain. One of the DEA agents, a man named Ferris, who'd been quiet during most of the hike, moved forward and addressed the group in a low voice. We need to approach this tactically. If there's someone in that cabin, they may be armed, and they definitely know we're coming if that dog gave any audible alert. I suggest we establish a perimeter first, make sure no one can slip out the back, then call out and see if we get a response. If there's no response, we clear the structure room by room. The plan was sound, and everyone agreed. They spread out around the clearing, moving slowly and using the vegetation for cover. Harlan positioned himself on the west side with a clear view of the cabin's front entrance, such as it was. The door appeared to be hanging crooked on broken hinges, and several of the windows were either missing their glass entirely or had boards nailed across them. Once everyone was in position, Agent Ferris called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with authority. "This is the Drug Enforcement Administration and Florida Highway Patrol. If anyone is in that structure, come out with your hands visible. We have the area surrounded. Do not make this situation worse by resisting." The words echoed off the trees and faded into the night sounds, and for a long moment there was no response. Then Harlan heard something, a faint scraping sound from inside the cabin, like wood moving against wood. Everyone tensed, weapons trained on the doorway. The scraping sound came again, followed by what might have been footsteps on the cabin's wooden floor. Then silence again, oppressive and nerve-wracking. Ferris called out once more, "This is your last chance. Come out now and no one needs to get hurt." Another long pause, and then a voice emerged from the darkness of the cabin's interior. Male, with an accent that Harlan couldn't quite place but sounded vaguely Latin American. "I'm not armed. I'm coming out. Don't shoot." The figure that emerged from the cabin doorway was not what Harlan had expected. He'd anticipated someone dangerous, a cartel enforcer or professional criminal. Instead, the man who stepped into the moonlight looked young, maybe mid-20s, thin and disheveled with clothes that were torn and muddy from days in the forest. His hands were raised high, and his face carried an expression of exhaustion and defeat rather than aggression. He stumbled slightly as he came down the cabin's broken steps, and Harlan could see he was favoring his left leg as if injured. The K-9 handler kept his dog under control as Agent Ferris and one of the other DEA agents moved in to secure the subject. They ordered him to his knees, hands behind his head, and conducted a quick search to ensure he wasn't carrying weapons. Finding none, they secured his hands with flex cuffs and helped him to his feet. Ferris looked back at the rest of the team. "Clear the cabin. Make sure there's no one else inside." Harlan and Clint Raines approached the structure carefully, flashlights sweeping through the broken doorway before they entered. The interior of the cabin was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned hunting camp. Rotted furniture, debris scattered across the floor, holes in the roof that let in patches of moonlight, and the smell of decay and animal droppings. They cleared each of the 3 small rooms and found no one else, just evidence that someone had been using the cabin recently. There was a sleeping bag in one corner, some empty water bottles, and a small backpack. Harlan picked up the backpack and brought it outside where Agent Ferris was questioning the detained man. The subject was sitting on the ground now, his breathing labored and his face pale even in the dim light. Up close, Harlan could see he was younger than he'd first appeared, probably no more than 22 or 23, and he looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were soaked with sweat and water. He had scratches and cuts all over his exposed skin from pushing through the forest vegetation, and his left ankle was swollen badly enough that it was visible even through his mud-caked sneaker. Ferris was attempting to get information from him. "What's your name?" The young man's voice was strained. "My name is Luis Ibarra. I need water, please. I haven't had water in hours." Clint Raines handed over a bottle from his pack, and Luis drank it desperately, nearly choking in his haste. When he finished, he looked up at the circle of law enforcement officers surrounding him. "I want to cooperate. I'll tell you everything. I just want this to be over." Ferris exchanged glances with Harlan, both men recognizing that they'd just caught a break. Most suspects in this kind of situation would lawyer up immediately or refuse to talk, but Luis Ibarra seemed ready to give them whatever they wanted. Ferris read Luis his rights from a card he carried, making sure everything was documented properly, and Luis waved them without hesitation. "I understand. I still want to talk. Ferris pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the ground between them, visible to Luis. This conversation is being recorded. You've waived your right to an attorney and agreed to speak with us. Is that correct? Luis nodded. Yes, that's correct. Ferris began the interview. Luis, let's start with the basics. Why were you in that surveillance camp watching State Road 19? Luis took a shaky breath. I was hired to watch for the truck, the semi carrying the shipment. My job was to make sure it made it through the forest without any problems, and if anything went wrong, I was supposed to report it immediately to my contact. Harlan spoke up. Who hired you and who was your contact? Luis looked at Harlan, and there was genuine fear in his eyes. I don't know names. I was contacted through a friend in Miami who said there was work available, good money for just watching a road for a week. They gave me cash up front, $5,000, and said I'd get another $5,000 when the job was done. I was supposed to call a number if anything happened to the truck, but when it went off the road during the storm, I panicked. I called the number like I was supposed to, but whoever answered just told me to stay in position and wait for instructions. Then hours went by and no one called back. I saw all the law enforcement show up at the crash site, saw them find the drugs, and I knew I was in serious trouble. So I ran. I've been trying to get to the road and get out of the forest, but I got lost and hurt my ankle. I thought I was going to die out here. Agent Ferris leaned forward. Do you still have the phone you were given to make contact? Luis gestured toward the backpack Harlan was holding. It's in there. It's a burner phone, nothing fancy. I only used it to call that one number. Harlan opened the backpack and found the phone, along with some protein bars, a water filter, and a pair of binoculars. He handed the phone to Ferris, who examined it briefly, then placed it in an evidence bag. Ferris continued the questioning. Luis, you said you were hired through a friend in Miami. What's that friend's name? Luis hesitated for the first time, and Harlan could see the internal conflict playing out on his face. Giving up a name meant potentially putting himself or someone else in danger, but refusing to cooperate would destroy any chance Luis had of getting a deal. Finally, he spoke. Marco Hidalgo. He's not a bad guy, just someone who knows people and passes along information about work opportunities. He's done it for me before, helped me get day labor jobs and construction work. This time, he said it was surveillance work, didn't mention anything about drugs. Ferris made notes. Do you know how Marco was contacted about this job or who he's connected to in the organization? Luis shook his head. No. Marco keeps that kind of information to himself. He said it was safer that way, that if I didn't know anything, I couldn't get in trouble. Obviously, that didn't work out. There was a bitter edge to his voice now, the realization that he'd been used and discarded sinking in. Harlan asked another question. When you called to report the crash, what exactly did you tell the person who answered? Luis closed his eyes, remembering. I told them the truck went off the road during the storm, that it crashed down an embankment and the driver was trapped. I told them I could see emergency vehicles responding and that it was going to be a major scene. The person on the other end didn't say much, just told me to stay hidden and wait for further instructions. That was around 0800 this morning. I never heard from them again. Agent Ferris looked at the other DEA agent who'd been listening silently. They cut him loose. Once they knew the shipment was compromised and law enforcement was involved, Luis became a liability rather than an asset. They probably figured he'd either get caught or die in the forest, and either way he couldn't lead us back to them. The other agent agreed. Standard cartel protocol. Low-level operatives are expendable. Luis looked between them, his face showing the horror of understanding his situation. You mean they were never going to pay me the other $5,000? They were just going to leave me out here? Ferris's expression was hard. "You're lucky we found you when we did. If you died of exposure or dehydration in this forest, no one would have found your body for months, if ever. The people you were working for don't care about you, Luis. They care about their product and their profits, and you were just a tool to them." Harlan saw Luis process this information, saw the fear transition into something else, maybe anger or determination. Luis straightened up as much as his injured ankle would allow. "Then I'll help you. I'll tell you everything I know and help you identify anyone I can. They left me to die, so I don't owe them anything." Ferris nodded. "That's a smart decision. But understand that what you know may not be enough to give us the people at the top. You were deliberately kept at arm's length from the real organization. What you can do is help us build a case against the people who recruited you, and that might lead us up the chain. In exchange, we'll talk to the prosecutor about a cooperation agreement that might keep you out of prison, or at least reduce your sentence significantly." The group decided to suspend the interview and get Luis back to civilization where he could receive medical attention for his ankle and be processed properly. The hike back to the crash site took nearly 3 hours, slower than the outbound journey because Luis's injury made it difficult for him to keep pace even with assistance. By the time they emerged from the forest, the sun was beginning to rise, and the scene at State Road 19's had shifted from a nighttime operation to a morning evidence collection effort. Luis was turned over to deputies who transported him to the hospital under guard, the same hospital where Roscoe Ledger was recovering, though they were kept in separate areas to avoid any possibility of communication or intimidation. Harlan was exhausted, his uniform soaked with sweat and swamp water, his boots caked with mud, but he knew his work wasn't done yet. He met with Lieutenant Vance and Agent Ferris to debrief on what they'd learned from Luis Ibarra. Vance listened to everything, then made a call to coordinate with the DEA's Miami office about tracking down Marco Hidalgo and anyone else who might be part of the recruitment network. Ferris was more interested in the phone they'd recovered from Luis, specifically the number that had been programmed into it for contact. "We'll run this through our databases and see if it connects to any known investigations. Chances are it's another burner, but sometimes we get lucky and find a phone that's been used multiple times or that's connected to other numbers we're already monitoring." Over the next several hours, the investigation expanded rapidly as different pieces of evidence were analyzed and connections were made. The DEA's Miami office located Marco Hidalgo at an apartment in Little Havana and brought him in for questioning. Unlike Luis, Marco was experienced enough with the criminal justice system to immediately lawyer up and refuse to answer any questions. But his phone records and financial information painted a picture of someone who'd been involved in recruiting low-level operatives for various criminal enterprises over several years. The phone number Luis had been given to call was traced to a location in the Tampa area, but by the time agents arrived at that address, it was empty. The burner phone had been destroyed, and whoever had been using it had disappeared. The Bartow Freight Company continued to cooperate with the investigation, providing records showing that the shipment Roscoe had picked up was completely off their official books. Someone had impersonated their company to create a cover story, and the real Bartow Freight had no knowledge of the drug operation. The GPS coordinates that Roscoe had been given for the delivery were analyzed and found to correspond to a remote location near the Osceola National Forest, about 60 miles east of Jacksonville. Agents who checked that location found evidence of recent activity, tire tracks and disturbed ground suggesting vehicles had been there within the past few days, but whoever had been using the location as a drop point had abandoned it once the shipment failed to arrive. Harlan spent most of the next week coordinating with various agencies, providing statements, and following up on leads that emerged from the investigation. He visited Roscoe Ledger twice more at the hospital, finding the trucker in better physical condition but clearly traumatized by everything he'd been through. Roscoe had agreed to enter witness protection once he was medically cleared for discharge, understanding that staying in Florida would put him at risk of retaliation. "I just wanted to do my job and make a living," Roscoe told Harlan during their last conversation. "I never imagined something like this could happen. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't checked that cargo, if I just delivered it like I was supposed to. I'd be complicit in moving millions of dollars of drugs into communities where it would destroy lives. But now my life is destroyed instead. I have to leave everything behind, change my name, start over somewhere else." Harlan didn't have easy answers for him. "You did the right thing by checking the cargo and by cooperating with us. What happened to you isn't fair, but you're alive and you have a chance to start over. A lot of the people in your situation don't get that chance." Roscoe nodded slowly. "I know, and I'm grateful to you for pulling me out of that truck. If you hadn't found me when you did, I'd have died in that wreck and no one would have known what happened." They shook hands, and Harlan left knowing he'd probably never see Roscoe Ledger again. The man would disappear into witness protection, would become someone else in some other part of the country, and the life he'd built over 30 years of truck driving would cease to exist. Luis Ibarra's situation was somewhat different. His cooperation had been genuine and valuable, providing investigators with information about how low-level operatives were recruited and managed. In exchange for his testimony, the prosecutor offered him a deal: probation and deportation back to Colombia where he'd been born, rather than a lengthy prison sentence. Luis accepted the deal, understanding that staying in the United States would mean either prison or becoming a target for the people he'd testified against. He was deported 3 weeks after his arrest, and Harlan heard through channels that Luis had returned to his family's farm outside Bogotá and was trying to rebuild his life away from the criminal elements that had nearly gotten him killed in the Ocala National Forest. The broader investigation into the drug trafficking operation continued for months, with the DEA working to identify the higher-level organizers and dismantle the network. The 2,000 pounds of cocaine seized from Roscoe's truck represented a significant financial loss for whoever was behind the operation, and there were reports of violence in Miami and Tampa as different factions blamed each other for the failure. Several low-level dealers and street soldiers were arrested in raids that followed the initial seizure, but the people at the top of the organization remained frustratingly out of reach. They'd insulated themselves with layers of cutouts and intermediaries, people like Marco Hidalgo and Luis Ibarra, who knew just enough to do their jobs but not enough to bring down the leadership. Harlan returned to his regular patrol duties in the Ocala National Forest, covering the same roads and responding to the same kinds of calls he'd handled for 9 years. But something had changed in how he viewed his work. The crash that had seemed like a routine accident rescue had turned into one of the largest drug busts in state history, and it had exposed him to a level of criminal sophistication he hadn't fully appreciated before. The forest wasn't just a beautiful wilderness area where people came to camp and hike. It was also a corridor for criminal activity, a place where drugs moved north from Miami and the Gulf Coast toward markets in Georgia and the Carolinas. The isolation that made the forest attractive to nature lovers also made it attractive to people who needed to move illegal goods without drawing attention. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the initial crash, Harlan was patrolling State Road 19 near the location where Roscoe's truck had gone off the road. The wreckage had long since been removed, and the forest was reclaiming the disturbed earth where the rescue operation had taken place. Harlan pulled over at the spot and sat in his cruiser for a few minutes, looking down the embankment and remembering the moment when he'd first seen the crashed truck and heard Roscoe's weak voice calling out. If he'd arrived even a few hours later, Roscoe might have died from his injuries or from exposure, and the drug shipment might have been recovered by the surveillance team before law enforcement ever knew it existed. The timing had been a matter of luck as much as anything else, a convergence of circumstances that had exposed the operation and prevented the drugs from reaching their destination. Clint Raines pulled up behind Harlan's cruiser in his Forest Service vehicle and walked over, leaning against Harlan's door. "You thinking about the crash?" Harlan nodded. "Yeah, just reflecting on how close it came to going the other way." Clint was quiet for a moment. "I've been working in this forest for 25 years, and I've seen a lot of things. Drug operations, illegal logging, people hiding from the law. This forest has always been a place where people think they can disappear or operate outside society's rules. But cases like this one, they remind me that there are people like you and me who won't let that happen. You did good work on this, Duval. You saved a life and took a huge amount of poison off the streets." Harlan appreciated the words, but couldn't shake a lingering sense of incompleteness. "We got the drugs, and we got a couple of low-level people, but whoever organized this operation is still out there. They'll just set up another route, recruit new people, and try again." Clint shrugged. "Maybe so, but that's not your responsibility alone. You did your part. The rest is up to the DEA and the feds to keep pursuing. You can't carry the weight of every investigation that doesn't end with perfect resolution." They stood in silence for a few minutes, listening to the forest sounds, the birds and insects and the rustling of wind through pine needles. Then Clint clapped Harlan on the shoulder and returned to his vehicle, heading north on his patrol. Harlan sat there a while longer, then started his engine and pulled back onto State Road 19, continuing his patrol through the Ocala National Forest where the afternoon sun filtered through the trees and cast dappled shadows across the road that wound endlessly through the wilderness. 3 months after the initial drug seizure, Harlan Duval thought the case had reached its natural conclusion. Roscoe Ledger was safely relocated through witness protection. Luis Ibarra had been deported back to Colombia, and the DEA's investigation into the trafficking network had stalled at the mid-level operatives who'd been smart enough to insulate the leadership from prosecution. The 2,000 pounds of cocaine sat in an evidence locker in Tampa, destined eventually for incineration once all the legal proceedings were complete. Harlan had received a commendation for his work on the case. A formal letter from the Highway Patrol Superintendent praising his quick response and professional handling of a complex situation. He'd filed the letter away in a drawer at home and returned to his regular duties, patrolling the forest roads and handling the routine calls that made up most of his work. It was early December now, and the Florida weather had finally shifted from oppressive summer heat to something almost pleasant. The temperatures were in the 60s and 70s during the day, cool enough that Harlan could patrol with his windows down and enjoy the fresh air instead of relying on air conditioning. The forest looked different in winter, the deciduous trees losing their leaves and creating more open sightlines, the palmetto scrub turning brown in places, and the wildlife patterns changing as animals adjusted to the cooler conditions. Harlan was working an evening shift that would run until midnight, covering State Roads 19 and 40 and several of the forest roads that connected them. Traffic was light, mostly locals who knew the roads well and the occasional tourist heading to one of the campgrounds or springs deeper in the forest. Around 2100 hours, Harlan was parked in a turnout near the intersection of State Road 19 and Forest Road 88, the same area where he'd responded to the call about Roscoe's crashed truck months earlier. He was filling out paperwork from a speeding citation he'd issued an hour ago when his radio crackled with a call that immediately grabbed his attention. "All units in the vicinity of Forest Road 11 and State Road 40. We have a report of gunshots heard in the area. Multiple calls from campers at the Four Lake Campground reporting what sounds like automatic weapons fire coming from the forest approximately 1 mile west of their location. Requesting immediate response." Harlan grabbed the mic, his pulse already quickening. Gunfire wasn't uncommon in the Ocala National Forest. There were legal hunting areas and people sometimes target practiced in remote locations. But automatic weapons fire was a different matter entirely. That suggested something criminal, either an illegal hunting operation or something worse. Dispatch, Unit 42 responding. I'm approximately 10 miles south of that location. ETA 12 minutes. He started his engine and pulled out onto the road, activating his lights and accelerating north. Other units responded as well, including a Marion County Sheriff's deputy and Clint Raines, who happened to be working late checking on some reported illegal camping in the northern sections of the forest. Harlan covered the distance quickly, his cruiser's engine roaring as he pushed it hard on the straightaways and braked carefully through the curves. As he approached the area where the gunfire had been reported, he killed his lights and slowed down, not wanting to announce his arrival to whoever was shooting. He turned onto Forest Road 11, a narrow dirt track that wound through dense pine forest with occasional clearings where hunters sometimes set up camps. The road was rough and Harlan had to slow to a crawl to navigate the worst sections without damaging his cruiser's suspension. About a mile in, he saw light flickering through the trees ahead, the orange glow of a fire or multiple fires, and he could hear voices carrying through the night air along with the sound of engines idling. Harlan pulled his cruiser off the road into a concealed spot behind a thick stand of palmetto and keyed his radio, speaking quietly. Dispatch, Unit 42. I have visual on what appears to be multiple vehicles and a camp approximately 1 mile west of State Road 40 on Forest Road 11. I can see fire and hear multiple voices and engine noise. I'm going to conduct a reconnaissance on foot before approaching. Advise other responding units to stage at my location and wait for my assessment. Dispatch acknowledged, and Harlan stepped out of his cruiser, taking his flashlight and ensuring his service weapon was easily accessible. He moved through the forest quietly, using the vegetation for cover, and approaching the lit area from an angle that would give him a good vantage point without exposing him. As he got closer, Harlan could make out more details. There were at least 4 vehicles, 3 pickup trucks and a large van, all parked in a rough circle around a clearing. Several portable generators were running, powering work lights that illuminated the area with harsh white light. There were people moving around, maybe 8 or 10 individuals that Harlan could see, all of them appearing to be working on something. As Harlan crept closer, staying low and moving slowly to avoid making noise, he saw what they were doing and felt his blood run cold. The people were loading packages into the vehicles, the same kind of plastic-wrapped packages that had been found in Roscoe Ledger's truck. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stacked in neat piles and being systematically transferred from what looked like a cache point into the vehicles for transport. Harlan's mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just a random drug operation. This was a major staging area where large quantities of narcotics were being prepared for distribution. The location was remote enough that they could work without being observed, and the forest roads provided multiple routes in and out that would make it difficult to establish roadblocks or cut off their escape. The gunfire that campers had reported was probably from security personnel testing weapons or conducting some kind of perimeter check. This was a sophisticated operation with significant resources, and Harlan was watching it unfold alone with backup still minutes away. He was about to pull back and wait for additional units when he saw something that made him freeze. One of the people working near the van turned toward the firelight, and Harlan got a clear look at his face. It was someone he recognized, though it took his mind a moment to place where he'd seen that face before. Then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. The man was Rick Talmadge, the FDLE officer who'd been part of the protective detail at the hospital when Roscoe Ledger was being interviewed. Harlan's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Talmadge was law enforcement, had been working the drug case from the inside, had access to all the investigative information and evidence. If Talmadge was here working with the people loading drugs, That meant he was compromised, either on the cartel's payroll or somehow coerced into helping them. Harlan's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and took several photographs, trying to document what he was seeing while keeping his position concealed. The flash was off, but he was terrified that the screen's glow would give him away. He managed to capture images of Talmadge and several of the other individuals, along with the vehicles and the packages being loaded. As he was taking the last photo, one of the men near the perimeter turned in his direction, and Harlan saw him raise a rifle and peer toward the tree line where Harlan was hidden. Harlan remained absolutely still, barely breathing, praying that the shadows and vegetation were enough to conceal him. The man with the rifle called out something in Spanish, and several other people stopped what they were doing and looked toward the forest. Talmadge moved into view, and Harlan heard his voice clearly. "What is it?" The man with the rifle responded in accented English. "Thought I saw movement in the trees. Could be an animal." Talmadge walked toward the perimeter, stopping about 20 yards from where Harlan was hiding. "Check it out. We can't afford any surprises." The man with the rifle started moving toward the tree line, and Harlan knew his position was about to be compromised. He had seconds to make a decision. Stay hidden and hope the man didn't see him, or retreat and risk making noise that would definitely alert them to his presence. Neither option was good. Harlan made the call to retreat, moving as quietly as possible deeper into the forest, away from the clearing. He'd gone maybe 30 feet when he heard a shout behind him. "Hey, alguien aquí! There's someone here!" The forest erupted with activity, multiple voices yelling, flashlight beams sweeping through the trees, and the sound of people crashing through the underbrush toward his position. Harlan abandoned stealth and ran, using his knowledge of the terrain to navigate through the darkness, while the sounds of pursuit grew closer behind him. He keyed his shoulder radio as he ran, his voice urgent. "Dispatch, Unit 42. I've been spotted and am being pursued by multiple armed subjects. I need immediate backup at my location on Forest Road 11. Be advised, one of the subjects is an FDLE officer who appears to be working with the suspects. Treat this as an officer safety emergency." The response from dispatch was immediate and alarmed. "Unit 42, confirm your last. Did you say an FDLE officer is present with the suspects?" Harlan was breathing hard now, pushing through palmetto that tore at his uniform and dodging between pine trees. "Affirmative. Officer Rick Talmadge is on scene and appears to be part of the operation. I have photographic evidence. Requesting immediate tactical response." Behind him, he could hear his pursuers getting closer, and then he heard something that made his heart skip. Gunfire. Multiple weapons opening up, bullets snapping through the air around him and impacting trees with sharp cracks. They weren't just trying to catch him. They were trying to kill him. Harlan drew his service weapon as he ran, knowing that if they cornered him he'd have to make a stand, but he was outnumbered at least 8 to 1, and they had automatic weapons while he had only his sidearm. His best chance was to keep moving and stay ahead of them until backup arrived. He could hear sirens in the distance now, multiple units responding to his emergency call, but they were still too far away to help immediately. Harlan's boot caught on a root, and he went down hard, his weapon flying from his hand into the darkness. He scrambled to find it, his hands searching frantically through the pine needles and undergrowth, but the flashlight beams were getting closer and he didn't have time. He abandoned the search for his weapon and pushed himself up, continuing to run even as he heard voices shouting that they'd seen him fall. His lungs were burning and his legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept him moving. Then the forest ahead opened up and Harlan found himself at the edge of a ravine, a steep drop of maybe 20 feet down to a creek bed. He didn't hesitate, sliding down the slope in a barely controlled fall, rocks and dirt cascading around him. He hit the bottom hard, his ankle twisting painfully, but he kept moving, splashing through the shallow water of the creek and scrambling up the opposite bank. Behind him, several of his pursuers reached the top of the ravine and opened fire again, bullets kicking up water and mud around him. Harlan felt something hot slash across his left arm, a searing pain that told him he'd been hit, but he didn't stop to assess the damage. He pulled himself up the bank and kept running, the sounds of pursuit continuing but slightly more distant now. The ravine had bought him a few precious seconds. The sirens were getting louder, and Harlan could see flashing lights through the trees now, multiple vehicles converging on the area. He angled toward the lights, hoping his pursuers would break off rather than risk being caught by the incoming law enforcement response. His hope was realized when the gunfire behind him suddenly stopped, and he heard shouting in Spanish, orders to fall back. The tactical decision made sense for them. They'd compromised their position, law enforcement was descending on the area in force, and their priority would shift from eliminating the witness to escaping with as much of their product as possible. Harlan emerged from the forest onto Forest Road 11, about a quarter-mile south of where his cruiser was parked, and he was immediately met by Marion County Sheriff's deputies who'd been among the first to respond. One of them, a young deputy named Travis Henning, caught Harlan as he stumbled and helped him stay upright. "Trooper, you're hit. We need to get medical attention." Harlan looked down and saw that his left sleeve was soaked with blood from the gunshot wound to his arm. The adrenaline had kept him from feeling the full extent of the injury, but now that he'd stopped running, the pain was hitting him hard. "I'm okay. The suspects are fleeing the scene, multiple vehicles heading deeper into the forest. They have automatic weapons and they're transporting large quantities of narcotics, and one of them is an FDLE officer, Rick Talmadge. He's compromised and working with the cartel." The deputy's eyes widened. "A dirty cop? Are you sure?" Harlan pulled out his phone, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through his wounded arm. "I have photos. Get me to whoever's coordinating the response. We need to lock this area down now before they escape." Within minutes, a command post had been established, and units from multiple agencies were coordinating a response. Roadblocks were set up on all the forest roads leading out of the area, and a helicopter with thermal imaging was en route from Tampa. Harlan was treated by paramedics who bandaged his arm and determined that the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He refused transport to the hospital, insisting he needed to brief the incident commanders on what he'd seen. Lieutenant Vance arrived and listened grimly as Harlan described the scene and identified Rick Talmadge as being present with the suspects. Vance immediately made calls to FDLE Internal Affairs and to the DEA agents who'd been working the original case. The photographs Harlan had taken were downloaded and analyzed, and they provided clear evidence of Talmadge's involvement in the drug operation. Warrants were issued immediately, and attempts were made to contact Talmadge through official channels, but his phone went straight to voicemail and he didn't respond to radio calls. He'd gone dark, understanding that his cover was blown. The tactical response team that moved into the clearing where Harlan had observed the loading operation found it abandoned. The vehicles were gone. The generators had been shut down and removed, and the only evidence left behind were tire tracks and some scattered packaging material. The suspects had successfully fled, taking their drug shipment with them and disappearing into the vast network of forest roads that offered dozens of possible escape routes. Over the following hours, some of the roadblocks paid off. One of the pickup trucks was intercepted near the eastern edge of the forest, and 2 suspects were arrested along with several hundred pounds of cocaine. Another vehicle was found abandoned near Forest Road 77 with its cargo still inside, suggesting the driver had panicked and fled on foot when they saw law enforcement ahead. But the majority of the suspects and the bulk of the narcotics escaped, and Rick Talmadge was not among those captured. A manhunt was organized, with every law enforcement agency in Central Florida on alert for Talmadge and the missing vehicles. His home was searched and found empty. His bank accounts showed recent large cash withdrawals, and analysis of his phone records revealed months of communications with numbers associated with known drug trafficking organizations. The betrayal hit the law enforcement community hard. Rick Talmadge had been a respected FDLE officer with 15 years of service and multiple commendations. He'd worked organized crime cases and had been trusted with sensitive information and access to witnesses. The investigation into how long he'd been compromised and how much damage he'd done would take months, but the immediate concern was apprehending him before he could flee the country or disappear completely. Harlan spent the next several days giving statements and working with internal affairs investigators who were trying to piece together Talmadge's activities. It became clear that Talmadge had been feeding information to the cartel for at least 2 years, alerting them to investigations, warning them about planned raids, and helping them adjust their operations to avoid detection. The original drug seizure from Roscoe Ledger's truck had put enormous pressure on Talmadge's handlers. The loss of that shipment and the arrests of low-level operatives like Luis Ibarra had disrupted the organization's activities and forced them to accelerate plans for moving remaining product before law enforcement could identify and shut down additional routes. The operation Harlan had stumbled upon in the forest was an emergency measure, a rapid consolidation and distribution of drugs that had been cached in the forest for months, waiting for safe transport. Talmadge had been there not just as a corrupt cop, but as a key coordinator who knew law enforcement patterns and could help the cartel avoid detection. 2 weeks after the incident in the forest, a break came from an unexpected source. Mexican authorities arrested Rick Talmadge at a border crossing near Matamoros, attempting to enter Mexico with false identification and carrying over $200,000 in cash. He was extradited back to Florida within days and charged with drug trafficking, corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder of a law enforcement officer for his role in the operation that had nearly gotten Harlan killed. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life in prison, Talmadge agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His debriefings provided investigators with a detailed map of the cartel's operations in Florida, identifying corrupt officials at multiple levels, revealing safe houses and cash points throughout the state, and naming the mid-level and upper-level organizers who'd been insulated from prosecution. The information Talmadge provided led to a coordinated series of raids across 3 states that resulted in over 40 arrests and the seizure of several tons of cocaine and millions of dollars in assets. It was the most significant blow to the organization in years, and it had all stemmed from Harlan's initial response to what had seemed like a routine accident call months earlier. Harlan attended Talmadge's sentencing hearing 6 months later. Despite his cooperation, the former FDLE officer received a 20-year federal prison sentence, a compromise between the life sentence he deserved and the value of the intelligence he'd provided. Talmadge sat at the defense table, looking diminished and defeated, a man who'd thrown away his career and his freedom for money that he'd never get to spend. When given the opportunity to address the court, Talmadge turned to look at Harlan in the gallery. "I'm sorry for what I did and for putting you in danger. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I never meant for it to go as far as it did. I started taking money to look the other way on small things, and before I knew it, I was in too deep to get out." Harlan didn't respond, just stared back at Talmadge with an expression that was neither forgiving nor condemning, simply acknowledgement that he'd heard the words. After the hearing, Harlan walked out of the courthouse into the Florida sunshine and drove back to Marion County, back to the Ocala National Forest where his work continued. The forest roads were the same, the wildlife and the wilderness unchanged by the human dramas that had played out within its boundaries. But Harlan's perspective had shifted in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He'd always known that his job involved risk, that traffic stops could turn violent, and that criminals operated in the areas he patrolled. But the revelation that corruption could exist at such high levels within law enforcement itself, that someone like Rick Talmadge could betray everything the badge represented, had shaken something fundamental in how Harlan viewed the system he was part of. Clint Raines found him a few weeks later, parked in the same spot where he'd been on the night of the shootout in the forest. The ranger pulled up beside Harlan's cruiser and got out, joining him and leaning against the hood and looking out at the forest that stretched endlessly in all directions. "You've been quiet lately, more than usual." Harlan was silent for a moment. "Just thinking about everything that happened, how close I came to not making it out of that forest, how someone I trusted to watch my back was actually working for the people trying to kill me." Clint nodded slowly. "I heard about what Talmadge said at his sentencing, about not meaning for it to go so far. You believe that?" Harlan considered the question. "I believe he didn't start out planning to become what he became. But somewhere along the way, he made choices. Small ones at first, then bigger ones, and each choice made it easier to make the next one until he'd crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. That's the thing about corruption. It doesn't usually happen all at once. It's incremental, a slow erosion of principles until you look in the mirror one day and don't recognize who you've become." Clint was quiet for a while, then spoke softly. "You did good work. You exposed the corruption. You helped take down a major trafficking operation. And you survived when a lot of people in your position wouldn't have. That counts for something." Harlan wanted to take comfort in those words, but he kept thinking about Roscoe Ledger, the trucker who'd had his life destroyed because he'd accidentally gotten caught up in something beyond his control. He thought about Luis Ibarra, the young man who'd been recruited for what he thought was easy money and had nearly died in the forest as a disposable asset. And he thought about all the people whose lives had been damaged by the drugs that organization had moved, the addicts and their families, the communities torn apart by the violence that followed trafficking routes. The bust had been significant. The arrests had disrupted the operation, but Harlan knew that organizations like this one were resilient. They'd adapt, recruit new people to replace those who'd been arrested, and find new routes to move their product. The work was never really finished. It was an ongoing battle with victories and setbacks, moments of progress followed by new challenges. Harlan's job wasn't to win the war on drugs single-handedly. It was to do his part, to respond to calls and conduct traffic stops and investigate suspicious activity and hope that the accumulated efforts of thousands of law enforcement officers across the country would make a difference. Some days, that felt like enough. Other days, it felt like trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. But either way, Harlan would keep showing up, keep patrolling these forest roads, and keep doing the work that needed to be done. As the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clint Raines returned to his vehicle and drove off on his evening patrol. Harlan sat in his cruiser for a few more minutes, then started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The forest was quiet now, the daytime sounds giving way to the nocturnal chorus of insects and frogs and distant owls. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, other operations were probably taking place. Other people were making the same choices that Rick Talmadge had made, and other tragedies were being set in motion that would eventually require law enforcement response. But for tonight, the forest was peaceful, and Harlan Duvall drove through it alone with his thoughts and his memories, carrying the weight of everything he'd seen and everyone he'd failed to save, but also carrying the knowledge that he'd made a difference when it mattered most. The road wound on through the darkness, and Harlan followed it, because that's what he did, and that's what he'd keep doing until the day he couldn't do it anymore.